royalty, power, wealth, and a scent you can't quite forget. We imagine kings and queens bathed in gold, but what if some of them barely bathed at all? Behind the velvet curtains and diamond crowns lies a history far less polished and far more pungent. From medieval monarchs who feared water to modern royals who preferred perfume over soap, this is the side of history your textbooks politely skipped. So hold your nose, keep your manners, and prepare to meet 25 British royals whose hygiene was, quite literally, beneath them. You've been warned. Let's begin. Before we dive nose first into royal grime, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got plenty more history they don't teach in school. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and tell us what time it is where you are. Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Singapore? We want to know who's out there unraveling royal filth with us. All right, gloves on, let's get uncomfortable. 1. Queen Elizabeth I. She glittered in pearls, powdered her face with poisonous white lead, and styled herself as a divine being. The Virgin Queen, untouchable, unblemished, eternal. But behind the portraits, beneath the layers of ruffled silk and ermine cloaks, there lingered something less ethereal, an unmistakable odor, a humid mix of unwashed skin, rotting teeth, and the cloying stink of heavy perfume applied too late, too often, and too desperately. Queen Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, may have reigned over England's golden age, but her hygiene habits belong squarely to a far darker, dirtier past. Despite the grandeur of her image, that famous imperious stare, the flawless alabaster skin, the famously styled red wigs, Elizabeth was notorious, even in her own time, for her stubborn refusal to bathe. According to those close to her court, she would submerge herself in water only once a month, and that was if she was feeling particularly generous. Whether she needed or no, one courtier dryly observed. This wasn't entirely unusual for the Tudor era. Public bathhouses had long been shut down due to outbreaks of syphilis and the more convenient explanation that bathing encouraged immorality. But even by 16th century aristocratic standards, Elizabeth's aversion to water was excessive. It was also, as her reign progressed, increasingly hard to ignore. The Queen's personal physician once made note of her decaying teeth, blackened and crumbling from a diet overloaded with sugar, and likely infected. The sweet tooth that symbolized her wealth was quite literally rotting her from the inside out. Foreign ambassadors commented tactfully on her breath, which had turned, by her later years, into something resembling slow, aromatic vengeance. The French ambassador once confessed that speaking to her up close was a trial of endurance, and yet she was adored, worshipped, painted like a living icon, immortalized in canvases that erased the truth, that beneath the face paint was aging, illness, and an odor that perfume could not quite smother. Her chambermaids, those unfortunate enough to dress and undress her, knew what the rest of the world only guessed. Her underclothes were rarely changed, her wigs were rarely cleaned, and her chambers required constant perfuming to keep the atmosphere bearable. Her skin, exposed only during the hurried application of more cosmetics, was a patchwork of sores, discoloration, and tightly clotted powder. But here's the twist. None of it seemed to matter. Or rather, it was all part of the performance. Elizabeth's filth was hidden in plain sight, cloaked in iconography and symbolism. Her immaculate image, as virgin, goddess, monarch, was manufactured layer by layer, gown by gown, brushstroke by brushstroke, until the human body beneath it disappeared entirely. In a way, her dirtiness was part of the illusion. What better way to separate oneself from ordinary humanity than to become completely untouchable? Even ironically by soap and water? Her reluctance to wash may have been part ideological, part practical, and part personal. Water was considered dangerous. Doctors warned that bathing could open the pores and invite illness, a belief that Elizabeth, ever cautious, took seriously. And there was perhaps a deeper, more psychological resistance at play. To wash would be to confront the body, to acknowledge its mortality, its frailty, its feminine messiness. And Elizabeth, ever the architect of her own mythology, could not afford that kind of intimacy. She had no room for flaws, so she powdered them, perfumed them, and buried them beneath silks and ceremony. Still, those closest to her could smell the truth. Her laundresses had to deal with linens soaked in royal sweat. Her dentists, such as they were, had to clean around infected gums and loose teeth. Her ladies-in-waiting had to pretend not to gag. And as the queen aged, the tension between her image and her body grew impossible to ignore. There were rumors, whispered, not written, of ulcers, of infections, of sores that never quite healed. But these details were excluded from the official record. Only her smell remained as an unerasable trace. You can't paint over stench. And yet she endured, dazzled, dominated. Her body may have decayed, but her myth did not. In a court obsessed with order, hierarchy, and beauty, the queen smelled like power, stale, sweet, and slightly sour. But if Elizabeth was filth disguised as majesty, her successor was something far stranger. He didn't just avoid washing. He rejected the entire concept of cleanliness, body or mind. A man who feared water the way others feared poison. A man who wiped instead of washed. A man whose idea of hygiene involved a rag, a bottle of alcohol, and a well-practiced sense of denial. King James VI and I is next. And things are about to get much stickier. 2. King James VI and I. There are men who refuse to bathe out of laziness. There are those who avoid it out of stubbornness or shame or delusion. And then there was James, King of Scotland, and later King of England and Ireland, the first monarch to rule over all three crowns. James VI and I didn't just avoid hygiene, he treated it like treason. To understand James's reputation for uncleanliness, you must first understand James himself. Born prematurely, emotionally neglected, and politically shaped by assassination attempts, kidnappings, and court conspiracies. He was a man raised in cold castles and colder company. From childhood, he learned to rely on books, not baths, on arguments, not appearances. He came of age in a world where water was a threat and body odor was just part of the royal bouquet. James believed that bathing, real bathing with water and soap, was a dangerous, reckless act. Like many of his contemporaries, he thought that water opened the pores to sickness and softened the flesh to corruption. But James took this fear to remarkable extremes. Instead of bathing, he preferred to dab himself down with cloths soaked in wine, vinegar, or occasionally strong spirits. This was, in his mind, a medical ritual. In reality, it was a recipe for sour-smelling monarch. The result was not subtle. His clothes were perpetually stained, his hair unwashed and oily. Courtiers who came too close to him were said to grimace and shift subtly away. One ambassador dryly noted that James carried with him the odor of neglect. Another, less diplomatic, referred to the king's chambers as a place where fresh air had long since abdicated. His hands, never known for their cleanliness, were often described as sticky. He refused to wear gloves unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, they were rumored to be stained with sweat and wine. His fingernails were rarely trimmed. His wardrobe, layered, elaborate, expensive, was seldom cleaned. Silk and velvet are not known for their resilience to grime, and James's clothing bore the marks of repeated, enthusiastic use and very little laundering. But James was not a fool, nor was he unaware of his reputation. In fact, he leaned into it with a sort of smug intellectualism. Cleanliness, he argued, was a form of vanity. It distracted from the life of the mind. What mattered was the soul, not the skin. His body, he seemed to believe, was a vessel for divine rule and scholarly thought, not for soap. He surrounded himself with theologians, scholars, and artists, and wrote essays on kingship and government. This was, after all, the man who commissioned the King James Bible. But no number of translated psalms could mask the scent of a monarch who hadn't changed his shirt in a week. His views on hygiene extended beyond his personal habits. He discouraged excessive bathing at court, and many of his attendants followed suit. Cleanliness became suspect, almost political. To smell good was to suggest foreignness, Catholicism, or worse, French decadence. James preferred the odor of Protestant virtue, earthy, musky, slightly fermented. Even his romantic entanglements didn't seem to inspire a change. James was famously fond of his male favorites, especially George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham. Yet even in the throes of courtly affection, he remained firmly opposed to washing. Some historians have speculated that this aversion to physical cleansing was tied to deeper anxieties about the body, intimacy, and death. But James, ever the philosopher king, would have rejected such psychoanalysis. He simply saw no point in washing what would inevitably decay. And decay it did. In his later years, James suffered from arthritis, kidney stones, gout, and chronic digestive issues, none of which improved his scent. His speech became slurred, his skin blotchy, his body swollen. And yet he continued to rule, to write, to argue. His mind remained sharp even as his hygiene reached new depths. When he died in 1625, the royal undertakers are said to have struggled with the state of his body. The details were kept vague, the scent not. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for King James, a man of contradictions, scholar and slob, visionary and eccentric, a monarch who gave the English-speaking world one of its greatest literary treasures, and who, reportedly, smelled like damp curtains and spilled wine. But while James lived in fear of water, his successor embraced decadence. Lavish banquets, elaborate wigs, bedroom gymnastics, and velvet-lined filth. If James was allergic to bathing, Charles II simply forgot it existed. And when your mistresses start complaining about the smell of your furniture, you know your legend is getting ripe. If you've made it this far without reaching for a bar of soap, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next royal reek on this list. And while we're in between unwashed monarchs, where are you watching from? Tell us your city and what time it is. Are you brushing your teeth at 7 a.m. while learning Queen Anne rarely bothered? Or listening at 2 a.m. from a candlelit bathtub, silently judging? Either way, welcome. Now, back to the stench. 3. Queen Anne. It's one thing to be a monarch with questionable hygiene. It's another to be a monarch with questionable hygiene, 17 pregnancies, chronic illness, and a personal perfume budget that could fund a small army. Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, the reluctant unifier of Great Britain, and arguably the most physically miserable ruler in British royal history, managed to be all of these things at once. Her reign was marked by war, political upheaval, and the formation of the United Kingdom. But within her court, behind closed doors, and quite frankly within smelling distance, the more urgent battle was being fought between her body and basic cleanliness. Queen Anne was in pain. Constant, humiliating, stubborn pain. Obese, gout-ridden, and afflicted by a series of mysterious ailments that left her barely able to walk by middle age, she was trapped inside a body that seemed to rebel against her every morning. Her legs were so swollen she often needed assistance just to move across a room. Her face was bloated and pale. Her joints ached. Her energy waned. She could barely stand, let alone stand under a stream of water. So, she didn't. Anne's solution to her deteriorating health was to retreat into what some might charitably call self-care, and others would more accurately describe as a regime of scented neglect. She bathed infrequently, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of habit, and relied on clouds of perfume, powders, and heavy fabrics to maintain the illusion of composure. Her wardrobe was famously extravagant, designed less for elegance than for concealment. Layers of brocade and silk draped over a body that struggled to regulate its own temperature. In summer, her rooms were reportedly unbearable. The smell of sweat, illness, and floral perfume hung in the air like a permanent fog. Court gossip had a field day. Servants noted, discreetly and then not so discreetly, that the Queen's bedchambers often reeked, a combination of sour linens, stale powders, and the smell of old food left behind by frequent midnight snacks. She often spilled wine or meat gravy on herself and didn't change garments regularly. Chambermaids had to coax her into fresh underclothes. Physicians hovered nearby with tinctures and tonics that did very little. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths. Anne's medical treatments, such as they were, didn't help. Bloodletting, laxatives, poultices, and compresses only added new aromas to the royal ambiance. She often had open sores on her legs and was prone to fainting fits. Rather than clean her skin, her attendants frequently dabbed her with cloths soaked in lavender or rose water, a practice that, while aromatic, did little to halt the buildup of grime. The Queen, meanwhile, preferred to keep things simple. Avoid exertion, avoid confrontation, and avoid water. Her teeth were another matter. Though less infamous than Elizabeth's, Anne's dental hygiene was similarly poor. Sugar was a daily indulgence, and dental care was still medieval. She reportedly suffered from chronic toothaches, which she attempted to ignore with admirable grit and a steady flow of brandy. When her speech became slurred, some chalked it up to alcohol. Others suspected infections. Either way, conversations with the Queen were better experienced from a respectful distance. But here's where things get complicated. For all her personal messiness, Anne wasn't a caricature. She was deeply religious, politically shrewd in her own guarded way, and fiercely loyal to those she loved. Her letters to Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, are among the most emotionally intense correspondences in royal history. She governed during a period of extraordinary change and faced relentless pressure from Parliament, from rival factions, and from her own failing health. It's easy to mock her for the smell. Harder to imagine the daily reality of ruling a country while feeling like your own body is collapsing underneath you. There's also a cruel irony at play. Anne presided over a court obsessed with appearances. Fashion was militarized. Perfume was weaponized. Decorum was everything. Yet here was the monarch, the very figure around whom the entire hierarchy revolved, sinking slowly into a private swamp of aches, powders, and unwashed sheets. In a way, her hygiene became a silent rebellion. If the throne couldn't keep her healthy, why pretend? Still, as her reign progressed, the rumors intensified. Foreign dignitaries made veiled comments about the Queen's atmosphere. Visiting nobles kept meetings short. Her own ministers began issuing orders without expecting her to attend meetings in person. She became a presence, symbolic, distant, increasingly mythic in her isolation. Her stench, like her sovereignty, traveled without her. In the end, Queen Anne became a kind of tragic symbol, a woman rotting under the weight of a crown she couldn't escape. Her body was a battlefield, her scent the ghost of wars fought in private. But if Anne's filth was the product of suffering, her successor's was the result of something else entirely: madness, untreated and unyielding. A king whose mind cracked under pressure, and took his hygiene with it. When King George III started talking to trees and wearing the same outfit for days on end, the nation grew concerned. His attendants, however, were already holding their breath. 4. King George III. By the time King George III was seen talking to an oak tree, most of his court had already learned to brace themselves for more than just uncomfortable conversation. His mind may have wandered, strayed, and eventually shattered, but it was his body, and more precisely his body's scent, that truly signaled something had gone wrong. Officially, George was mad. Unofficially, he was unwell in every imaginable way. The monarch whose reign saw the American colonies revolt, the Napoleonic Wars ignite, and Britain stumble toward modernity, also oversaw a slow and pungent decline into something much harder to define. You can track the progression of George III's hygiene like a map of his unraveling mind. Early in his reign, he was considered rather proper, even austere, a family man, a farmer king, a moral compass in an age of scandal-prone royals. But as his mental health began to fracture in the late 1780s, so too did his interest in grooming, cleanliness, and clothing. At first, the signs were subtle. A missed shave here, an unchanged shirt there, but soon the patterns became more dramatic. He would dress in the morning, forget he was dressed, and then redress, sometimes several times a day. He'd wear the same waistcoat for days, convinced it was clean, even as it visibly wasn't. His garments bore the creases of sleep, the smudges of food, the faint shimmer of perspiration that no amount of royal embroidery could disguise. Then came the refusals. Refusals to change, refusals to wash, refusals to allow even the most trusted attendants near him. As paranoia crept in, George began to suspect tampering, poisoning, betrayal. Water, once tolerated, became suspect. Baths were rejected. Clean linens were viewed with hostility. Some days he refused to allow his bed to be made, convinced that the act would disturb some imagined order only he understood. And still he ruled, or at least appeared to. Court physicians were baffled. Parliament grew anxious. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands. But the smell, the scent of sweat trapped in layers of wool, the odor of illness and anxiety steeped into the upholstery, gave the game away long before the headlines caught up. His rooms reportedly became so unpleasant that staff rotated in short shifts, citing headaches, nausea, and the timeless royal excuse, indisposition. The worst episodes came in cycles. During his most severe breakdowns, George's speech became frenzied. He spoke for hours without pause. He scribbled long, incoherent letters. He sang. He cried. He refused food or devoured it with childlike abandon. And through it all, he remained marinated in his own decline, his clothes unchanged, his hair uncombed, his fingernails left to grow and blacken at the tips. Yet despite the state of his hygiene, George retained a curious charm. Visitors noted that even in madness, he was polite, kind, passionate. He spoke with great emotion about farming, astronomy, music, and faith. His compassion for animals remained intact. His grief over lost children was raw and sincere. But he no longer recognized social boundaries, or physical ones. He would stand too close, grip a hand too long, forget he had already greeted someone and do it again. And again. Each time, with a scent that lingered. When his illness intensified in the early 19th century, he was effectively removed from power. His son, the future George IV, acted as Prince Regent. George III, meanwhile, was confined to Windsor Castle, where he lived out his days surrounded by servants trained not only in medicine, but in discretion. They kept the doors closed, the windows open, and the real state of the king carefully obscured from public view. He would live like this for nearly a decade, blind, dazed, often mute, rarely washed. By the time of his death in 1820, the man who had once prided himself on Protestant virtue and moral leadership had become a symbol of tragic decline, a ruler brought low not by scandal or war, but by something far more insidious, the slow decay of the mind and the neglect that followed in its wake. In retrospect, George's hygiene, or lack thereof, became a silent record of his suffering. The smudged waistcoats, the greasy hair, the wrinkled sheets. These were not mere lapses in etiquette. They were symptoms of a deeper collapse, a reminder that kings are only human after all, even when their minds say otherwise. But as George faded into tragic obscurity, his son emerged from the shadows. And where the father neglected himself out of confusion, the son did so out of something else entirely: indulgence. If George III forgot to wash, George IV simply couldn't be bothered. The next monarch would not just neglect his hygiene, he would wrap it in silk, drown it in perfume, and declare it fashionable. 5. King George IV. Some monarchs were undone by illness, others by war. King George IV, however, was slowly and luxuriously defeated by himself. One pudding, one wig, one unlaundered waistcoat at a time. If his father, George III, decayed tragically, then George IV rotted with flair. He was known as the First Gentleman of England, a title bestowed less for any actual gentlemanly behavior and more for his lavish spending, high fashion, and taste for opulence. He was also, by most credible accounts, a walking contradiction, a monarch who bathed in excess and yet refused to wash. A man who could spend 3 hours picking out a waistcoat but couldn't be bothered to change it once it began to smell. A royal who, despite a wardrobe that could clothe a village, frequently wore the same stained garments until they turned from silk to cautionary tale. George IV was, by the time he took the throne officially in 1820, deeply and unapologetically unhygienic. Years of overeating, drinking, and medical neglect had taken their toll. He had ballooned to over 300 pounds, suffered from chronic gout, and perspired almost constantly. And yet, rather than address these bodily realities with some routine bathing or even a nod to basic cleanliness, George leaned into denial and perfume. He was obsessed with scent, but not the clean kind. He layered colognes, musk oils, and powders with the aggressive enthusiasm of a man trying to outpace his own biology. Visitors described his personal aura as overpowering, sickly sweet, and dense. One French observer noted that it was like standing next to a florist's shop set on fire. But no bouquet, however exotic, could quite mask the fundamental truth. George smelled like a man who dressed richly but lived poorly. His undergarments, those few he allowed staff to replace, were reportedly worn until the fabric gave up entirely. Laundry was not a priority. Tailors complained of returning garments only to find them ruined beyond repair within weeks. His shirts grew yellowed under the arms, his collars dark with accumulated oils and sweat. He sweated profusely, often during royal audiences, leaving silk chairs with damp impressions that had to be discreetly dried between appointments. Staff began placing linen pads on furniture ahead of his visits, not for etiquette, but for sanitation. Despite this, George saw himself as the height of refinement. He surrounded himself with glittering objects, ornate furniture, gilded mirrors, and imported fabrics. His apartments at Carlton House, and later at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, were dazzling, and yet, curiously, always needed windows flung open. Servants circulated constantly with scented cloths and incense burners. Behind the grandeur, there was a quiet panic to control the environment, not politically, but olfactorily. His hygiene habits extended beyond clothing into his famously indulgent diet. Meals were long, heavy, and sloppily eaten. Gravy stains on royal garments were common. Napkins were used infrequently, plates licked occasionally. He favored rich meats, heavy creams, sweet wines, and vast quantities of brandy. Physicians warned him, repeatedly and with increasing alarm, that his health was collapsing. His response was typically regal, denial followed by another meal. Court satirists and cartoonists had a field day. George became an easy punchline, the bloated dandy, the decadent glutton, the king whose wigs were powdered but whose armpits were not. One popular caricature showed him reclining in a sweat-soaked chair, surrounded by clouds of perfume and empty dishes, with a chambermaid holding her nose in the corner. It wasn't far from reality. Even his lovers, and he had many, commented on his physical state. Though we'll spare the details, let's just say that proximity did not improve the situation. While his father's decline was tragic and quiet, George's was decadent and public. The people noticed. Parliament noticed. Eventually, even George noticed, and simply stopped appearing in public altogether. In his later years, George became reclusive. Blinds drawn, doors closed, curtains pulled. His body had become a source of constant discomfort. He could barely walk. He suffered from severe edema, could not bend easily, and often required assistance just to rise from a chair. Reports from inside Windsor described a monarch whose clothes no longer fit, whose bed linens were changed as infrequently as possible due to his irritable outbursts, and whose scent greeted you before he did. And still, through all of this, George held on to his self-image, the stylish king, the fashionable ruler, the patron of the arts. He commissioned paintings that flattered him. He surrounded himself with beauty. But nothing, not the Versailles-worthy interiors, not the mirrored halls, not the finely tailored coats, could erase the truth. He had become a monument to unchecked indulgence and undisturbed filth. If George IV showed what happens when a man chooses perfume over soap, his mother, Queen Victoria, would embody a different kind of denial. Cleaner, perhaps, but not much, because under all her mourning black and moral superiority was a woman who believed cleanliness was a luxury, and undergarments were eternal. 6. Queen Victoria. History remembers Queen Victoria as the matriarch of an empire, the embodiment of prudish morality, the namesake of an entire era. She gave the world a straight-backed image of somber restraint, widowhood as identity, and a stiff upper lip capable of enduring anything, except perhaps a thorough bath. Behind the portraits and the royal decrees, behind the carefully cultivated persona of mourning and moral supremacy, Victoria's relationship with cleanliness was complicated, not scandalous, not grotesque, just shockingly indifferent. It's not that she was dirty in the dramatic, candle-melting, nose-wrinkling sense of some of her predecessors. No, Victoria's filth was subtler, slower, domestic. It crept in through routine and made itself comfortable. It clung to habits, clung to fabric, clung to the undergarments that, according to court sources, she insisted on wearing until they wore themselves out. Despite being a queen in the industrial age, surrounded by advancing technologies and rising hygienic standards, Victoria held on to deeply Victorian ideas about the body, ideas rooted in privacy, modesty, superstition, and an almost mystical fear of being too clean. It wasn't uncommon in her time to believe that overwashing weakened the constitution. Pores, once opened by warm water, were considered vulnerable entry points for disease. Medical manuals of the day warned against overbathing as a kind of slippery slope to illness, moral decay, and effeminacy. Victoria took this advice to heart. Her bathing schedule was infrequent, brisk, and driven more by obligation than comfort. Sources close to her household describe her baths as more symbolic than sanitary. Quick affairs involving lukewarm water and a washcloth applied with royal disinterest. She bathed roughly once or twice a week, if that. And when she did, it was a ritual of mild inconvenience, something to be gotten through so she could get back to the real business of empire building and letter writing. But her most legendary hygienic habit, or lack thereof, was her unwavering attachment to her clothing, specifically her undergarments. Victoria, for reasons that remain both psychologically rich and tragically practical, believed in wearing things until they fell apart, not in the charming thrift-conscious sense. In the literal, threadbare, you can see daylight through it sense. Staff would repeatedly attempt to replace her linens and garments with fresh ones, only to be rebuffed with statements like, "They are quite serviceable." There are records of underclothes being mended several times rather than replaced, stitched up, patched over, reinforced like tiny battle flags from past domestic wars. Whether this was the result of thrift, routine, or some quiet superstition about the power of worn fabric, it's hard to say, but it became a pattern. Victoria also sweated. A lot. This, again, isn't scandalous. It's human, but it became notable when combined with her disinterest in bathing and her reluctance to swap out clothing. Royal attendants remarked on the lingering musk of stale body odor in her private chambers. Her black morning dresses, layered, heavy, and endlessly reused, trapped heat and moisture. Summer months were especially trying. Her hair, which she insisted be styled in the same fashion for decades, was rarely washed and prone to oiliness. The bonnets helped cover it. The smell? Not always. To be fair, Victoria was not a recluse like her son would later become. She was active, engaged, and despite her withdrawn image, involved in state affairs almost until the end. But she was a product of contradictions. The queen who symbolized progress but avoided plumbing. The mother of modern Britain who could not be moved to change a pair of stockings until they were nearly translucent. Her marriage to Prince Albert, by all accounts, was deeply affectionate, but even Albert reportedly nudged her toward slightly better hygiene habits. After his death, her habits worsened. Mourning, for Victoria, became an all-encompassing state, emotional, psychological, sartorial, and olfactory. She wore black for 40 years. Her linens still rarely changed. Her chambers increasingly sealed off and preserved in a kind of perpetual gloom. And yet, like so many monarchs with poor hygiene, none of this stained her legend. Victoria remains one of the most iconic rulers in British history. Her face appears on stamps, coins, statues. Her name is invoked as a shorthand for moral order and national pride. But the truth is, beneath the polished marble of her image lies a reality much less pristine. A woman who ruled an empire with iron will and sweat-stained petticoats. But if Victoria's filth was institutional, hidden under layers of black crinoline and widowhood, her son would take a more flamboyant approach. King Edward VII didn't try to hide the smell. He simply covered it in cigars, silk sheets, and scented scandal. And as it turns out, even the finest French brothels had something to say about the king's lingering aroma. 7. King Edward VII. If Queen Victoria's approach to hygiene was one of passive resistance, a stoic refusal to change her linens because tradition said not to, then her son, King Edward VII, practiced something closer to theatrical negligence. Where she was threadbare and mournful, he was extravagant and indulgent. She wore black for 40 years. He changed outfits 5 times a day, but rarely let soap make an appearance between wardrobe changes. Edward was born into suffocating expectations. As the heir apparent to the longest reigning monarch in British history, he waited in the wings for nearly 6 decades, forbidden from doing much of anything except existing. So he compensated. Lavishly. By the time he ascended the throne in 1901, Edward had already cultivated a global reputation. Lover of Parisian culture, champion of fine cuisine, collector of silk, and, more quietly noted by those around him, a man of pungent habits. His hygiene shortcomings were not subtle. Courtiers, valets, and social acquaintances alike described a monarch who looked dashing but didn't smell it. He was a paradox in polished leather shoes. Always dressed immaculately, his shirt front starched and his cufflinks gleaming, And yet his personal odor often preceded him into the room, and lingered after he left. Edward was, simply put, a man who perspired. He sweated during dinners. He sweated during walks. He sweated while standing still. And unlike his mother, who swaddled herself in wool and stoicism, Edward surrounded himself with finery. Delicate silks, rich velvets, tight waistcoats, none of which breathed. His body, already stocky by youth and obese by middle age, was forced daily into layers of non-absorbent fabric, creating the perfect pressure cooker for body odor. What made it worse, and for historians more fascinating, was his complete disinterest in resolving the issue. Like many aristocrats of his era, Edward relied heavily on perfume. But where others dabbed and misted, he marinated. Musk, cologne, scented oils. He applied them like war paint. The result was a dense, almost medicinal aroma that mingled with the natural byproducts of his body. One French hostess once remarked that the king left a memory in every room, a scent and a stain. Even among his own staff, his habits became legend. His underclothes were reportedly damp by midday, and yet he resisted frequent changes. His bed linens were changed infrequently, not from frugality, like Victoria, but from stubbornness. He didn't see the point. He preferred sleeping in his own personal stew of cologne and old sweat. Valets were instructed not to mention it. Footmen learned to crack windows slightly and discreetly fan the air behind his back. And then, of course, there was his dental hygiene. Edward had notoriously poor oral health, a fact that made close conversations less than pleasant. He smoked heavily, cigars, not cigarettes, and rarely brushed. Combined with rich food, wine, and indifferent bathing, the overall effect was persistent. Diplomats, especially from drier cultures, found meetings with him to be olfactorily memorable. But here's the twist. People adored him. Despite the sweat, the scent, and the stained upholstery, Edward VII was wildly popular. Unlike his mother, who inspired respect through distance, Edward won affection through charm. He was funny, witty, approachable. He remembered names. He could disarm political tension with a joke, distract foreign leaders with a compliment, and smooth over scandal with a glass of wine and a well-timed wink. He humanized monarchy, made it social, almost bohemian, and in doing so gave the British public a glimpse of something dangerously close to relatability. Of course, beneath the jovial exterior was a man deeply entrenched in denial. His health deteriorated rapidly in his later years. His weight ballooned. His mobility declined. Doctors begged him to reform his habits, moderate his diet, and, above all, consider bathing with actual water. He declined, repeatedly. If Victoria had clung to her threadbare garments as a symbol of continuity, Edward clung to his indulgence as a symbol of defiance. Cleanliness was for peasants. Real kings wore their scent like a legacy. When he died in 1910, the nation mourned him with surprising intensity. Not because he was a great statesman or even a memorable reformer, but because he had made the monarchy feel, for a moment, human, fallible, overfed, and just a little bit funky. But if Edward VII's filth was draped in silk and masked with charm, the monarch who came before him wore his decay like a badge of battle. King Henry VIII wasn't trying to impress you with perfumes or illusions. He simply expected you to endure him, especially near the end, when his smell became the stuff of whispered legend, and no one dared tell the king that he was the worst-scented man in Christendom. 8. King Henry VIII. In the grand, greasy tapestry of royal filth, King Henry VIII doesn't just earn a place. He demands it, thunders into it, and slams the door behind him. He wasn't merely unhygienic. He was monumental about it. Larger than life in every way, in appetites, in temper, in waistline, and, unfortunately, in odor. You probably know the headline facts: 6 wives, 2 beheadings, the English Reformation, a closet full of increasingly wide tunics. But what most history books gloss over, mercifully perhaps, is what Henry VIII actually smelled like during the latter half of his reign. Because while he may have split with Rome and restructured the very foundations of English religious life, he never quite figured out how to manage his own scent. It wasn't always this way. In his youth, Henry was athletic, charming, even considered handsome. He was known for his jousting, his musical talents, and his golden locks. But time, injury, paranoia, and the steady creep of disease had their way with him. By his 40s, the once vigorous monarch had transformed into a swollen, irritable, deeply unpleasant man, physically and otherwise. And with that transformation came a sharp decline in hygiene. At the center of the problem was a medical condition that plagued him for much of his later life: festering leg ulcers. The polite term is weeping sores, but let's just say they made his physical presence not only visually jarring but olfactorily aggressive. These ulcers, mostly on his lower limbs, refused to heal. They leaked, they crusted, they required constant dressing changes, and worst of all, they smelled badly, even by the rather loose standards of 16th century personal maintenance. Courtiers reported that the king's chambers were thick with the scent of ointments, bandages, and something less definable, something that no amount of incense or sweet herbs could fully suppress. His physicians tried everything: poultices, lancing, cauterization. Nothing helped for long. The rot returned. The king remained in pain and surrounded by an atmosphere of quiet dread, both medical and nasal. By this point, bathing was out of the question, not just because of prevailing Tudor fears that bathing spread disease, a popular belief of the time, but because Henry physically couldn't manage it. His bulk, his injuries, and his royal ego combined to make even basic washing a logistical challenge. Instead, he turned to other means. He wore layers of perfume shirts. He demanded fresh clothes daily, but rarely the kind that involved scrubbing his actual skin. He trusted in linen, lavender, and the power of expensive distraction. This worked on some. Foreign dignitaries would comment, tactfully, on the magnificence of his wardrobe and the grandeur of his presence, all while stepping discreetly away. But his closer courtiers, the ones who had to help him in and out of bed, who attended his privy chamber, knew better. They inhaled the truth. They lived with the fact that the most powerful man in England was, in his final years, also one of the least pleasant to be near. Yet, and here's the uncomfortable irony, Henry never saw himself this way. His self-image remained fixed somewhere in the golden past, when he was a gallant young monarch with a trim waist and a flawless beard. In his mind, he still had that charm, that vitality, that royal glow. The idea that his presence might repulse others was never allowed to take root. He was the king, and kings don't stink. Or rather, if they do, it becomes part of the mythos. Henry's overpowering presence, his booming voice, his tempestuous moods, his appetite for control, was only amplified by the physical discomfort he carried with him. His odor wasn't merely a side effect, it became part of his legend. The king who could dismiss a pope and a wife with the same sneer, and who carried the scent of untreated decay wherever he went. Even in death, the story stuck. His burial was marked by delays and missteps, and though Victorian historians tried to clean up the narrative, earlier chroniclers were less polite. There were accounts, apocryphal perhaps, but enduring, of unpleasant leaks from his coffin. The smell of mortality, refusing to be buried. Henry VIII's legacy is carved into English history with the sharpest of chisels. He reshaped the monarchy, reshaped the church, and reshaped what royal power looked like. But behind the portraits in the palaces, there lingers an inescapable truth. The man who ruled with absolute authority could not rule over his own body, not its breakdown, not its wounds, and certainly not its scent. If Henry's filth was born of pain and denial, then his son would take up the torch with silent indifference. King Charles II may have been called the merry monarch, but beneath the laughter, the wigs, and the long nights lay a man who bathed even less and laughed off the consequences. 9. King Charles II. If King Henry VIII was the reeking thunderstorm of Tudor tyranny, then King Charles II was the musky fog that rolled in afterward, charming, evasive, and heavily perfumed. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles ruled in the aftermath of civil war and regicide, a king restored to a throne that had once beheaded his own father. But while he brought with him a new era of wit, fashion, and political slipperiness, he also ushered in something else, a return to royal filth, this time laced with gallows humor and expensive cologne. Charles II was a man of appetites, social, political, culinary, and otherwise. His court was famous for its energy, its excess, and its apparent allergy to personal boundaries. But among all the gilded flirtation and endless banquets, one thing was notably absent: bathing. Regular, functional, soap and water bathing. He didn't hate water, he just didn't trust it. And why would he? In 17th century England, bathing was still viewed as dangerous, especially in cold climates. There were fears about disease entering through the skin, about weakened immunity, and about the effeminate dangers of caring too much about one's appearance. For Charles, water was for fountains and naval fleets, not for scrubbing one's royal backside. Instead, he adopted the standard hygiene strategy of the Restoration elite: scented gloves, dry powders, layered clothing, and enough perfume to make a passing whiff feel like a walk through a botanical apothecary set on low boil. The idea was to mask the smell, not remove it, hide the evidence, not fix the crime. And mask he did. Charles was rarely seen without a cloud of musk and floral oil hovering nearby. His barbers and valets were tasked less with cleaning him and more with maintaining the illusion of cleanliness. His wigs were regularly powdered, his clothes frequently changed, but his body remained largely untouched by water, soap, or fresh air. Behind the scenes, it was known that he could go weeks without a proper bath. When asked about his habits, he allegedly quipped that he had no desire to wash away the oil of kingship. It's a clever line. It's also a convenient excuse. But perhaps the most reliable testimonies about Charles's hygiene come from the women who knew him best, his mistresses. And he had many. Nell Gwynn, Barbara Villiers, Louise de Querouaille, to name just a few. They adored him, tolerated him, and in some cases complained, privately, about the royal smell that seemed to cling to everything he touched. His sheets, his furniture, his clothing. His mistresses reportedly joked that you could identify which rooms the king had visited by the lingering perfume and something less floral. Palace servants, of course, had fewer romantic illusions. They were tasked with cleaning up after the monarch, often in ways that involved less politicking and more laundering. They complained of sweat-stained linens, worn woolens that absorbed odor like a sponge, and boots that required frequent fumigation. The royal dogs, of which there were many, added their own unique aroma to the royal apartments. But it was Charles himself who provided the central note in the palace's ambient scent profile: musky, fermented, and stubborn. And yet, none of this seemed to touch his popularity. After the long shadow of Oliver Cromwell and the grim Puritanism of the English interregnum, Charles II was a breath of air, if not exactly fresh. He was witty, sociable, and good at making people feel heard, even as he maneuvered around them politically. He loved the theater, tolerated satire, and understood that being a king in the Restoration era meant entertaining the public almost as much as ruling them. People forgave the smell, or at least laughed it off. In many ways, his filth was political, a symbol of return. Under Cromwell, England had endured years of forced piety, sober attire, and unperfumed austerity. Charles came back with silks, feathers, French wine, and a nose-blind tolerance for body odor. He was monarchy rebranded, decadent, and slightly sticky. He reigned for 25 years, during which he survived the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London, multiple assassination plots, and an uncountable number of dinner parties. Through it all, he remained largely unwashed and universally adored. When he died in 1685, his final words were reportedly, "Let not poor Nellie starve." A generous sentiment, but perhaps his valet's unspoken plea might have been, "Let someone open a window." But if Charles's grime came wrapped in silk and sly witticisms, his brother and successor, King James II, brought none of the charm and all of the odor. Less perfume, less flair, and far more sweat. Where Charles was merry, James was merely moist. 10. King James II. If King Charles II was the rakish rogue who could distract you from his body odor with a wink and a joke, then his brother, King James II, was the opposite, solemn, serious, unamused, and unmistakably smelly. Where Charles covered his filth in scented oils and restoration charm, James simply let his hang in the air, unapologetic and unembellished. He was, in short, not a man known for masking things. Neither his politics, nor his ambitions, nor the fact that he often looked and smelled like he'd been rolling in last week's laundry. Born in 1633, James grew up in the same exiled, turbulent environment as his older brother. He, too, had seen war, regicide, religious conflict, and exile. But where Charles responded to these traumas with humor and hedonism, James reacted with military discipline, Catholic devotion, and an unwavering sense of his own righteousness. What he lacked in charm, he tried to make up for in certainty. But somewhere in that equation, personal hygiene got thoroughly left behind. Contemporary observers, even those sympathetic to his reign, noted his greasy, unkempt hair, his rumpled clothes, and his near-permanent smell of sweat and wine. Unlike Charles, who was at least surrounded by silks and scented wigs, James made little effort to hide the grime. His personal style leaned toward the practical, the militaristic, and the vaguely damp. He often wore the same garments repeatedly, especially favored uniforms and coats, which soaked up the smells of daily wear and returned them with interest. His hygiene habits were so poor, in fact, that even his enemies noticed. Political pamphlets from the time mocked him not only for his Catholicism and authoritarian leanings, but for his visible disinterest in cleanliness. Protestant satire delighted in describing him as a greasy papist, who reeked of continental indulgence and English neglect. His Catholic allies in France were only slightly more generous, privately noting that the English king was not concerned with matters of polish. He rarely bathed, even by the minimal standards of the 17th century. Water to him was to be avoided unless absolutely necessary, and possibly even then. Like many royals of the time, he relied on scented gloves, powders, and linen shifts to absorb sweat. But he didn't change those linens often enough for the strategy to work. His personal chambers were noted for being unusually stuffy, poorly aired, and filled with the unmistakable smell of royal stagnation. Valets and attendants wrote with increasing resignation about the state of his wardrobe. His undergarments were rarely fresh. His boots often sticky with accumulated moisture. His wigs, which by this point were mandatory for men of his rank, were seldom cleaned and had a habit of slipping awkwardly on his oily scalp. Barbers complained that his hair was difficult to manage due to long periods without washing. Physicians remarked on recurring skin irritations, which they attributed to sweat, poor diet, and fabric that hadn't seen soap in weeks. What made James's lack of hygiene more unsettling than Charles's was that there was no counterbalance, no charm, no disarming wit, no flirtation to soften the experience. He was stern, blunt, and notoriously lacking in patience. One courtier described standing beside the king as a test of one's loyalty and lung capacity. Others simply avoided close proximity altogether, which in a way suited James. He wasn't trying to win anyone over. He wanted to be obeyed. His reign, like his personal aura, was heavy. He pushed aggressively for Catholic reforms in a Protestant nation, alienated both Parliament and the Anglican Church, and surrounded himself with a small, loyal, and increasingly nose-blind circle of supporters. As his political power waned, his scent, unfortunately, did not. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 removed him from the throne without a battle, a relatively rare and polite expulsion, considering British history. He fled to France, where he was given asylum by Louis XIV, another monarch not known for bathing. Perhaps fittingly, James spent his final years in exile, surrounded by fellow nobles who also believed soap was suspicious, and that sweat was a sign of divine labor. He died in 1701, largely forgotten by his former kingdom, except in the way all unpleasant houseguests are remembered, vaguely, with relief, and by the lingering smell in the upholstery. But if James's scent clung to velvet and regret, the next monarch's filth was more tragic than repellent. Queen Mary. I didn't just smell of sweat and illness. She reeked of sorrow, secrecy, and a body burdened by sickness and symbolism. 11. Queen Mary. In the theater of Tudor tragedy, Queen Mary once is usually cast as the villain, the dour Catholic, the bloody monarch, the religious zealot who turned the realm into a funeral pyre. But behind the smoke of political legend stands a figure far more complicated. A woman raised in isolation, ruled by disappointment, and haunted by the relentless betrayal of her own body. Her hygiene, or lack thereof, was less a matter of neglect than of grief. The kind of grief that seeps into your skin, your clothes, and the very air around you. Born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary entered the world as a royal heir, only to be declared illegitimate when her father tore England from Rome and her mother from the throne. She spent much of her youth in exile from power and affection, surrounded by religious tutors and increasingly hostile political winds. By the time she became queen in 1553, she was already physically fragile, emotionally scarred, and deeply suspicious of those around her, and it showed, not only in her politics, but in her person. Mary was not known for vanity. She wore simple gowns by royal standards, often in dark, heavy fabrics that made her look older than her years. Her health was delicate and visibly so. Pale skin, persistent fatigue, and intermittent fevers marked her reign as much as any decree. Courtiers noted her thinness, her trembling hands, her eyes rimmed with chronic exhaustion. But what they also noticed, and more than one servant recorded, was her smell. Mary disliked bathing, deeply, almost ritually. Though some of this aversion was cultural, many tutors still believed that bathing could open the body to illness. Mary took it further. Unlike her sister Elizabeth, who masked her own hygiene lapses with layers of perfume and a masterful sense of theatricality, Mary made little effort to conceal her bodily decline. Her physicians, while loyal, commented on her aversion to water and her preference for scented cloths, heavy gowns, and frequent prayer as her primary forms of purification, and this avoidance had consequences. Her undergarments were changed infrequently. Her bed linens, too, were reportedly soaked with sweat during long periods of illness and left unchanged for concerning amounts of time. The scent that lingered in her chambers was described in letters as damp and thick with the perfume of mourning. Visitors spoke of rooms that smelled less like royal apartments and more like infirmaries. a mixture of dried herbs, musty fabric, and the low, sour odor of someone perpetually unwell. Her reliance on perfumes, particularly rosewater and musk, became more pronounced as her health declined. But unlike the flamboyant clouds of fragrance worn by Charles II or the luxurious layers favored by George IV, Mary's use of scent had a mournful, almost desperate quality. It wasn't meant to allure. It was meant to conceal, a bodily confession hidden under rosaries and rose petals. Mary's poor hygiene was compounded by a series of phantom pregnancies that devastated her emotionally and physically. On at least 2 occasions, she was believed to be pregnant by her court, her physicians, and even herself. The anticipation of an heir, a Catholic successor, consumed her. Rooms were prepared, cribs were carved, bells were readied, but the child never came. Instead, her body swelled inexplicably. Her moods darkened. Her physical discomfort increased. And yet, she refused to allow attendance too close. Medical care was limited. Washing was delayed. The royal body became not only a source of mystery, but a site of silent suffering. This cycle of anticipation and disappointment left its mark. Mary became more withdrawn, more guarded, and reportedly, more pungent. Her attendants did their best. Herbs were burned in the hearths. Flowers were kept in every corner. But nothing quite masked the truth, that their queen was decaying in slow motion, and that no amount of devotion could reverse it. In her final months, Mary was beset by a combination of fever, melancholy, and suspected cancer. Her breath grew faint. Her skin, once alabaster, became waxen. Visitors commented not only on her appearance, but on the air in her room, heavy, damp, and oppressive. By then, even her most loyal courtiers admitted she could no longer manage the basics of care. Yet she resisted outside help, clinging to privacy even as her body betrayed her once more. She died in 1558 at the age of 42. England, exhausted by religious swings and public executions, exhaled with relief. Her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne, ushering in a new era, brighter, more theatrical, and slightly more powdered. But Mary's legacy lingered, in policy, in history, and perhaps in the upholstery of the royal apartments. Her reign may be remembered for its flames, but her body was a quieter burn, slow, sad, and scented with resignation. If Mary wore her decay like a shroud of sorrow, the next monarch carried it with the careless ease of youth. King Edward VI was young, brilliant, and tragically brief, and yet even in his short life, he managed to attract whispers of filth from those who stood too close. 12. King Edward VI. By the time King Edward VI took the throne in 1547, England had already grown accustomed to volatile monarchs and their ever-shifting fragrances of decay. He was just 9 years old when the crown was placed on his head, a pale, serious boy raised on Protestant scripture and humanist philosophy, now expected to rule a kingdom still hung over from his father's many marriages and his sister's brief, bloody reign. But while Edward was hailed as a boy king of promise, even holiness, the truth behind the embroidery was more pungent. For all his tutors and theological treatises, Edward wasn't exactly a model of cleanliness. In fact, according to the quiet complaints of his attendants, he might have been one of the least hygienic monarchs of the Tudor line. And that's saying something in a dynasty where soap and sanity were both optional. Of course, allowances must be made. Edward was a child, and children are rarely paragons of hygiene. But Edward wasn't just any child. He was a child surrounded by physicians, advisors, and a retinue of servants whose entire purpose was to maintain the illusion of royal perfection. And yet, even within this tightly managed environment, reports began to leak, not just in writing, but unfortunately, in scent. Ambassadors and visiting dignitaries noted his appearance with diplomatic caution. Pale, delicate, and very earnest, one noted. Another observed that the king speaks with the wisdom of a man, but has the habits of a schoolboy. That last part was not just a metaphor. Several foreign visitors remarked, somewhat less tactfully, on the young king's unclean fingernails, his rumpled clothing, and his often disheveled state. One, a French courtier, described Edward as a boy of great promise, though frequently in need of a basin. Edward's hygiene habits were what we might charitably call inconsistent. He was known to go days without washing, especially during periods of illness, which were frequent. He suffered from bouts of fever, fatigue, and chronic respiratory issues. His skin, already pale and blotchy, would often appear mottled with grime from a combination of sweat, illness, and inattention. His hair was rarely combed thoroughly, his hands often sticky or stained with ink from his constant journaling, and he journaled a lot. Edward was a prolific writer, obsessively documenting political developments, religious reforms, and even his own health, though never, curiously, his own hygiene. He wrote of the punishments of heretics, the appointments of bishops, the instability of his nobles, but not once did he mention washing his hands. Apparently, some details were too personal for even the most introspective tutor. His attendants, especially the nurses and chamberlains assigned to his daily care, reportedly struggled to maintain a sense of order. Edward, intellectually precocious as he was, could be obstinate. He preferred to study rather than dress, to rid rather than bathe. When servants tried to enforce routines of cleanliness, he resisted with quiet disdain. After all, he was the supreme head of the Church of England. Surely he had better things to do than soap behind his ears. There was also, no doubt, a political element at play. Edward was being groomed as a Protestant prince, austere, disciplined, morally upright. Vanity was frowned upon, lavishness discouraged. Cleanliness, unfortunately, was often thrown in with the rest. His mentors taught him to fear idleness, not odor. They prized spiritual purity over physical upkeep. A little dirt on the hands was the mark of a serious mind. A few stains on a collar? Proof that the king was working hard. Still, the visual and olfactory toll of this lifestyle was impossible to ignore. His garments, heavy Tudor fabrics that trapped heat and moisture, were not changed as frequently as they should have been. Linens became stale. Bedclothes took on the sour smell of sick-room humidity. Attendants reportedly burned herbs in the fireplace to mask the smell of the royal quarters, especially during Edward's final year, when his health took a visible and increasingly fragrant nosedive. By 1552, it was clear that the boy king was not well. He coughed incessantly. He grew thinner by the week. His complexion faded to a translucent gray. Theories ranged from tuberculosis to pneumonia to every Tudor-era medical catch-all known to man. What is certain is that his hygiene declined in tandem with his health. As his strength failed, so did any remaining inclination to wash. His servants noted his growing refusal to change clothes or be disturbed for grooming. He was in pain, and increasingly he smelled like it. He died in 1553, aged just 15. His body, frail and exhausted, left behind a Protestant legacy far bigger than himself, but also, it seems, a final impression among those who had to prepare him for burial. One courtier described the young king's final weeks as a time of silence, study, and sickness. Another, less poetically, called it an ordeal for those who were near him. Edward VI may have ruled briefly, but he set the stage for one of England's most enduring figures, a queen whose public image was legendary, but whose personal hygiene was, at times, politely avoided in conversation. Mary, Queen of Scots, would dazzle in silk and shadow, but leave her French courtiers gasping for more than just political clarity. They wanted fresh air. 13. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be. Beautiful, cultured, charismatic, and impeccably dressed. Her presence was magnetic, her court dazzling, and her reputation, depending on who you asked, either gloriously tragic or dangerously foolish. But if one listens carefully to the whispers left behind by her ladies-in-waiting and the more blunt observations of her foreign guests, another truth emerges, one that rarely makes it into oil paintings or romantic biographies. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, often smelled disappointing. Born in 1542 and crowned Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old, Mary spent her formative years not in the foggy Highlands, but in the glittering French court. It was there, among the Valois royalty and the perfume-saturated corridors of Château de Fontainebleau, that she learned how to be a queen, fluent in music, languages, embroidery, and politics. But apparently not in bathing. Ironically, France was considered one of the more fragrant places in Renaissance Europe, not because people bathed more often, but because they bathed better in perfume. Perfumed gloves, perfumed wigs, perfumed rooms. Scent was an accessory, a weapon, a mask, and in Mary's case, it was also a substitute for washing. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Mary was famously reluctant to bathe, even after strenuous activity. Hunting, dancing, riding, and playing sports, which she adored, were followed not by a splash of water, but by a change of dress and a dab of scent. Her French attendants, many of whom came with her when she returned to Scotland in 1561, wrote letters home expressing confusion and, occasionally, dismay. One courtier noted, in the faintly horrified tone of someone who had expected Versailles and received something closer to damp wool, that the queen often declines refreshment after exertion, preferring only to change her outer garment and sit in her own aroma. This aroma was no small matter. Mary's clothing, always elaborate, multi-layered, and rich with embroidery, was heavy and suffocating by design. These were not breathable fabrics. They were heat-trapping, sweat-absorbing, and rarely washed. Her court's climate in Scotland was colder and damper than France's, but her wardrobe remained the same. Overdressed and underwashed, she became something of a paradox. The best-dressed woman in the room and the least fresh. Even the royal laundry revealed signs of trouble. Mary was famously protective of her personal items and resistant to allowing her undergarments and linens to be handled too frequently. As a result, items were worn longer than advisable, and the cycle of dressing up, overdressing down continued. Courtiers eventually adapted by stuffing her rooms with lavender and rosemary, disguising the scent of lingering sweat with the olfactory equivalent of applause. But Mary wasn't oblivious. She was vain, but not stupid. She understood image better than most monarchs of her time, which makes her hygiene habits all the more curious. Because for someone so obsessed with control, she seemed oddly unconcerned with the physical evidence of human messiness. Perhaps it was willful denial. Or maybe it was a deeply internalized belief, drilled into her by the French court, that royalty could never truly be unclean, that sweat from a queen didn't smell like sweat from a peasant. Still, not everyone was so forgiving. Scottish nobles, many of whom already viewed Mary as a foreign interloper, were less than impressed with her hygiene. In private correspondence, they referred to the stifling nature of her chambers and the rich aroma that clung to her after hunts. During her brief and ill-fated marriage to Lord Darnley, servants in the royal household allegedly noted the tension between the Queen's romantic ideals and her rather less romantic post-exercise aura. But perhaps most telling are the accounts from ambassadors, the professional eavesdroppers of history. The English, of course, had every reason to be uncharitable toward Mary, given the dynastic chess game she posed to Elizabeth I. Still, their reports were remarkably consistent. Admiration for her intelligence, concern for her judgment, and subtle, often coded complaints about her presence. The tragedy of Mary's life, imprisoned, manipulated, and eventually executed after nearly 2 decades in captivity, has overshadowed many of these smaller, stranger details. But the picture they paint is compelling. A woman raised to be admired, groomed for elegance, yet seemingly unwilling to acknowledge that elegance might require water. She was not grotesque, she was not filthy, but she carried with her a faint trail of contradiction. The smell of roses layered over exertion, a queen who knew how to play the part, but didn't always want to clean up after the performance. When she was finally executed in 1587, aged just 44, her body was reportedly discovered wearing several layers of clothing and a hidden crucifix, symbolic, sacred, secret. The scent of mystery followed her into legend, but not all royals cloaked their scent in mystique. Some, like the hunchbacked and much maligned King Richard III, let their presence be known through more direct means. Chroniclers whispered of his foul breath, his unkempt appearance, and a physical presence that made people uncomfortable long before he ever drew a sword. 14. King Richard III. If historical memory were a courtroom, King Richard III would be the defendant with the worst PR team in British history. Between Shakespeare's creative liberties, the Tudor propaganda machine, and one inconvenient skeleton found buried under a Leicester car park, Richard's reputation has been dragged through the mud for centuries. But beyond the hunchback and the murderous rumors lies a lesser-known, though no less pungent, detail. Richard III was not a man famed for freshness. Born in 1452 during the latter stages of the 100 Years' War, Richard Plantagenet's life unfolded amid chaos, betrayal, and very little soap. He came of age in a world where war was seasonal, kingship was a gamble, and personal hygiene was a luxury for those with time and access to warm water, neither of which Richard often had. Raised in the shadow of larger, louder figures, most notably his brother Edward IV, Richard was seen as the more reserved, serious sibling. What he lacked in flamboyance he made up for in calculation, but he also carried with him, according to several contemporary sources, a certain air. Let's begin with the breadth. Multiple chroniclers, even though sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, noted that Richard had what was politely described as a foulness of mouth. One court observer, more blunt than diplomatic, described the king's breath as sharp and disagreeable, and claimed that even brief audiences with him required a certain mental fortitude. The cause of this olfactory offense isn't certain, but historians have speculated everything from poor dental hygiene to chronic illness. Some even suggest that his diet, which likely included a steady stream of rich meats, ale, and insufficient fresh produce, contributed to a perpetual state of oral decay. Dental care, it must be said, was not exactly thriving in the 15th century. Toothbrushes were rare. Toothpaste was more wishful thinking than a practical tool. The best-case scenario for most nobles involved rinsing with wine or vinegar and hoping for the best. Richard, often described as grim and practical, doesn't appear to have been particularly invested in this area of self-maintenance. His teeth were reportedly discolored, chipped, and often coated in plaque, the result of years of royal dining and minimal cleaning. Beyond his breath, Richard's general hygiene also drew quiet concern from those around him. His hair was said to be perpetually unkempt, his fingernails unclean, and his clothing, while regal in quality, often bore the marks of repeated, unlaundered wear. Unlike the dandified kings of later centuries, Richard did not appear to care much for appearances. His garments were functional, often military in cut, and suited for long days in the saddle. But practical does not mean pleasant. His time on campaign only made matters worse. Richard spent much of his life in the field, either managing border disputes or preparing for civil war. Medieval armies were not known for their cleanliness. Bathing facilities were rudimentary at best, non-existent at worst. As a commander, Richard was reportedly hands-on, respected for his discipline and fearlessness. But the price of that leadership style was often paid in sweat. His armor, which he reportedly wore often, absorbed and trapped body odor like a steel sauna. And armor was not easily cleaned. After a few weeks on campaign, one might imagine it developed a personality of its own. Perhaps the most telling accounts come not from battlefield reports, but from court life. At formal events, Richard was known to keep his distance. Some believed it was a symptom of his introverted personality. Others whispered that it was a matter of discretion, for olfactory reasons. Even members of his own household reportedly complained that his chambers required frequent refreshing with herbs, coals, and open windows. It's worth noting, of course, that Richard's reign was brief and violent. He ruled from 1483 to 1485, a period dominated by internal strife and suspicion. His seizure of the throne, following the disappearance of his young nephews, the so-called princes in the Tower, made him one of the most controversial monarchs in English history, and when he died at the Battle of Bosworth Field, his legacy passed quickly into the hands of his enemies, most notably Henry Tudor and his very skilled propagandists. Shakespeare's Richard III, the villainous bottled spider, solidified the image of a deformed, malevolent figure whose external appearance mirrored his corrupted soul. But the bard left out one key sensory detail. According to those closest to him, the king might have smelled almost as bad as his reputation. Centuries later, when Richard's remains were discovered in 2012 beneath a Leicester car park, forensic evidence confirmed the presence of scoliosis, giving partial truth to the legend of his twisted spine. But the diggers found no definitive cause for his halitosis or his reputation for filth. Perhaps that's for the best. If Richard's uncleanliness was a metaphor for political decay, the next monarch leaned into it with monastic conviction. King Henry VI, more mystic than monarch, believed that to wash the body was to feed the sin of vanity. And so, in an age where piety and odor were sometimes synonymous, England found itself with a king who quite literally suffered for holiness, and made everyone around him suffer too. 15. King Henry VI. Some monarchs rule with iron fists, others with sharpened tongues or gilded alliances. But King Henry VI ruled, if one can call it that, with prayer, silence, and the faint but unmistakable smell of spiritual neglect. Born in 1421, crowned as an infant, and inherited by chaos, Henry VI was not built for the job of king. He wasn't interested in war, strategy, or even politics. He was deeply pious, painfully shy, and emotionally fragile in ways that even his courtiers struggled to describe. He preferred monasteries to palaces, psalms to proclamations, and solitude to statecraft. In short, Henry was less king, more monk, and he smelled accordingly. The line between sanctity and sanitation in the 15th century was a thin one. And Henry, determined to walk the straight path to spiritual purity, avoided most forms of bodily indulgence, including, quite often, bathing. While his contemporaries were beginning to embrace the occasional bathhouse or scented cloth, Henry took a more austere route. He believed that the body was a vessel for sin, a distraction from divine work. Cleanliness, in his worldview, bordered on vanity. Washing too often was not only unnecessary, but morally suspect. The dirt, after all, was not just physical. It was symbolic. To carry the grime of the world on one's skin was, in Henry's case, practically a badge of honor. And so he carried it. Court records and chroniclers speak, delicately at first, and later more candidly, about the king's increasingly unkempt appearance. His clothes were plain, often old, and rarely changed. He favored worn wool over fine silks and linen that bore the signs of repeated use and minimal laundering. Even his shoes were noted to be scuffed and occasionally falling apart. The message was clear. Henry had no time for earthly distractions. Unfortunately, that included soap. Attendants responsible for his personal upkeep often walked a fine line, torn between royal protocol and the reality of trying to care for a man who viewed grooming as a spiritual threat. Attempts to trim his beard or brush his hair were met with resignation or quiet refusals. Baths were scheduled, then quietly ignored. At times, he would allow himself to be washed in the most minimal symbolic sense. A cloth dabbed along the neck, a splash of water across the forehead, more ritual than hygiene. But when Henry entered deeper periods of religious reflection or mental withdrawal, what modern historians might call episodes of catatonia, even that minimal care ceased. There are periods recorded, particularly in the 1450s, where the king reportedly went weeks without speaking, barely eating, and refusing to change clothes. Servants noted the growing stench in his chambers. One courtier wrote that, "The king lies in holy silence, though his person gives off a rather earthly vapor." Foreign dignitaries who came to negotiate treaties or arrange marriages found themselves ushered into rooms that smelled more like a monastic cell than a royal court. One ambassador from Burgundy described Henry as gentle but faint of presence, adding with notable restraint that his robes bore the wear of considerable use. Behind the diplomatic language was a quiet horror, the realization that England's monarch had essentially renounced not just rule, but basic hygiene. Even his religious advisors, many of whom admired his piety, expressed concern. Confessors urged him to consider that cleanliness might serve not vanity, but health. Physicians warned of the dangers of infection, skin disease, and the simple social implications of being unwashed in a court that still, despite everything, had standards. But Henry resisted. He preferred silence to argument. And as long as his body kept moving, however slowly, he saw no need to interfere with its course. This neglect wasn't confined to personal cleanliness. Henry's royal apartments were sparsely decorated, dimly lit, and notably damp. Windows were left shut. Fires burned low. Linens were reused until they frayed at the edges. His bedding was simple, but rarely fresh. On more than one occasion, palace staff had to request royal permission to air out the chambers, a task that reportedly required much caution and many candles. It wasn't malicious. Henry wasn't defiant. He simply didn't care. His mind was elsewhere, always hovering between scripture and sorrow. And the body, to him, was just something to be endured until it returned to dust. By the time he was deposed, more than once, Henry had become a ghost of a monarch. His reputation among the public was that of a holy fool, too kind to lead, too weak to save, too passive to bathe. When he was eventually imprisoned and later found dead in the Tower of London in 1471, the political world moved on with barely a backward glance. But those who remembered him, the priests, the valets, the unfortunate courtiers who had tried to coax him into clean linens, knew that his legacy was more than religious melancholy. It was a lesson in what happens when power is held by someone who believes the body is best ignored. And if Henry's filth was the product of asceticism and retreat, the next monarch's grime came from sheer, gleeful slovenliness. King John, the infamous tyrant of Magna Carta fame, didn't avoid cleanliness for spiritual reasons. He just couldn't be bothered. And his barons, already ready to revolt, soon discovered that their king ruled not only with cruelty, but with a deeply offensive musk. 16. King John. If ever there was a monarch who perfectly embodied the phrase dirty politics, it was King John. And not just metaphorically. His political dealings were grubby, his leadership style slimy, and according to those who got close enough, his physical presence was unpleasant in ways that had little to do with diplomacy. This was a king whose enemies hated him, whose nobles barely tolerated him, and whose body odor seems to have added insult to injury. Born in 1166, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was never expected to inherit the throne. and perhaps England would have been better off if he hadn't. History remembers him largely as the tyrant who provoked the barons into forcing the Magna Carta down his throat. But there's another, more textured portrait behind the royal seal, one in which John, even in an era not known for high sanitary standards, stood out as particularly unwashed. Descriptions of King John's appearance were not flattering, even by the charitable standards of medieval chroniclers. He was of average height, with a squat build, thinning hair, and what one monk politely referred to as a restless, sweating countenance. Another chronicler was less kind, describing him as greasy of hair and foul in gesture, a man who stank of wine, meat, and bitter temper. But it wasn't just about physical appearance. John had a reputation at court for being personally slovenly. Unlike other monarchs of the Plantagenet dynasty, who at least maintained the illusion of regality, John openly disdained the niceties of courtly life. He dressed plainly, sometimes even lazily, and reportedly wore the same robes for days at a time. His garments were often wrinkled, stained, and visibly worn. While his royal wardrobe accounts included luxurious items, these seemed more for ceremony than regular use. On a daily basis, John favored comfort over cleanliness, which in 13th century England, where linen was precious and washing inconvenient, meant his comfortable choices often reeked. Personal grooming was a similar afterthought. His hair, which contemporary depictions show as thin and close-cropped, was often described as oily and unkempt. He rarely washed it, and when he did, it was more likely due to pest infestations than personal initiative. His fingernails, observed by scribes at court, were known to be long and dirty, and his hands often bore the stains of ink, food, or whatever business had occupied him before reluctantly showing up to court. And then there were the smells. John's poor hygiene wasn't just a private matter, it was part of the public perception of his decay. Chroniclers repeatedly alluded to his unpleasant humors, a medieval euphemism that could refer to any number of bodily emissions, but often meant a visible and tangible odor. His body, prone to sweating, particularly when angry, which was often, exuded what one courtier described as a sourness that hung about him in chambers and council. Combined with his penchant for rich, heavy food and wine, the result was a king who brought his full presence, physical and otherwise, into every room. Foreign dignitaries were unimpressed. Ambassadors from France and the Holy Roman Empire wrote back to their courts with thinly veiled disdain. One particularly scathing remark from a French envoy referred to John as a king of Greece, not grace. Even his allies, few though they were, noted that he seemed perpetually disheveled. One bishop wrote with more pity than malice that His Majesty lives with the disregard of a man who believes himself already damned. Part of this undoubtedly stemmed from John's character. He was notoriously paranoid, erratic, and cruel. He alienated the church, imprisoned opponents without trial, and taxed his nobles into open rebellion. But it's telling that alongside complaints about his tyranny were also those about his smell, his clothes, and the physical discomfort of being near him. His reputation for corruption was matched, sometimes literally, by his visible and olfactory decay. Even in death, John failed to inspire affection. He died in 1216 of dysentery, bloated, embattled, and largely abandoned. The monks tasked with his burial reportedly found the task distasteful, not simply for the moral weight of burying a disliked king, but for the sheer physical unpleasantness of dealing with his remains. There are hints, indirect but unmistakable, that his body, untreated and unwashed, was already unpleasant by the time the tomb was sealed. His tomb, incidentally, lies in Worcester Cathedral, a grand, imposing structure that now contains one of the least beloved kings in English history. Tourists pass through quietly, not realizing that the man beneath their feet was once known not just for signing away royal power, but for making entire banquet halls wince as he walked past. Yet if King John wore his filth like a badge of contempt, The next monarch in our line was less openly detestable and more tragically mismatched with his station. King Edward II would inspire baronial revolts and whispered scandals. But among his lesser-known offenses was his startling indifference to royal decorum and his tendency to show up to court smelling like a stable, not a throne room. 17. King Edward II. Some kings are undone by war, others by betrayal. King Edward II was undone by a combination of both, along with a deep, enduring aversion to basic hygiene. Where other medieval monarchs cloaked their dirt in velvet and incense, Edward often didn't bother. He ruled England not with dignity or strategy, but with the careless musk of someone who believed that being king meant never having to change your shirt. Born in 1284, Edward was the fourth son of Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots. His father was a warrior king, stern, pragmatic, terrifying, and he expected the same from his heir. What he got instead was a sensitive, impractical young man more interested in rowing, ditch-digging, and petting farm animals than in the serious business of ruling an empire. From a young age, Edward showed signs of eccentricity. Unfortunately, those signs often came with a scent. Chroniclers describe Edward as physically robust but oddly disheveled. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and often quite strong, but he carried himself with the demeanor of a man who had just rolled out of a barn, because on many occasions he had. Edward was deeply fond of physical labor, especially the kinds that made other nobles nervous: hauling stones, thatching roofs, plowing fields, and shoveling mud. While his courtiers tried to guide him toward tournaments, feasts, and ceremonial events, Edward preferred mucking about with common laborers, which would have been eccentric but forgivable, if he'd washed afterward. But Edward, according to multiple sources, seemed either unaware of or completely indifferent to the lingering consequences of physical exertion. He would arrive to meetings with his nobles in clothes still damp with sweat or dirt, reeking of horse and hay, wearing boots caked with mud. His fingernails were often blackened with soil, his hair unbrushed and left to fall in unruly curls. Servants tasked with maintaining his wardrobe complained that his tunics and hose were stained beyond repair, worn for far too long between washes, and frequently riddled with mysterious, unidentifiable marks. One courtier wrote, with visible restraint, that His Majesty bears a love for the earth and oft appears to wear it. Another noted that Edward would often refuse clean clothing offered by his attendants, preferring to remain in the garments he found comfortable after a long day among the thatchers and stable boys. Even his royal apartments did little to elevate his status. While previous kings had taken pride in luxurious quarters with tapestries, incense, and the occasional fragrant herbs strewn about, Edward's rooms were functional, sparse, and frequently described as dank. Visitors commented on the musty smell of his chambers, where windows were rarely opened, and the scent of damp wool hung in the air like a warning. The scent, they added, was not improved by the presence of his various favorite animals which he allowed to roam freely. It wasn't that Edward lacked access to cleanliness, he simply didn't care. Public bathing was falling out of favor in medieval England, but private washing remained common among the nobility. Yet Edward saw hygiene not as a virtue, but as an inconvenience. Clean linens? A bother. Brushed hair? Unnecessary. Regular baths? A waste of time. He seemed to operate on the principle that royalty conferred automatic exemption from soap. This disregard for appearances extended to his public image. Nobles were expected to set an example, to radiate order, authority, and a touch of divine polish. Edward radiated something else entirely: casual disregard and the faint odor of livestock. His barons, already agitated by his political incompetence and deeply controversial favoritism toward Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, began to see his hygiene habits not just as eccentricities, but as symptoms of unfitness. To them, a king who couldn't keep his tunic clean probably couldn't keep a kingdom together either. And they weren't wrong. Edward's reign spiraled into rebellion, civil war, and eventual deposition. His personal habits became a metaphor for his political ones, careless, disorderly, and offensive to anyone forced to endure them. His lack of decorum wasn't just unseemly, it was destabilizing. A monarch's scent might be forgivable. His complete detachment from royal dignity was not. By 1327, Edward had been overthrown by his wife, Queen Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. Imprisoned, stripped of power, and humiliated, Edward faded from public life. He died under mysterious and still debated circumstances, and with him died a reign that smelled more like a sheepfold than a throne room. But Edward's earth-stained disinterest in hygiene would be echoed again, further north, in the mists of the Scottish court. King James V of Scotland, another monarch who favored indulgence over ablution, would take up the banner of royal funk with proud defiance, leaving French ambassadors to wonder if Highland fog was the only thing keeping the court tolerable. 18. King James V of Scotland. If royal filth were an Olympic sport, King James V of Scotland would have walked away with a medal and left the podium slightly damp and vaguely scented with horse. His reign was not long nor especially successful, but it was fragrant in all the wrong ways. Among his contemporaries, James V was known less for his politics or military might than for his uncanny ability to make a lavish court feel like a poorly ventilated stable. Born in 1512, James V inherited the throne as a toddler after the death of his father, James IV, at the disastrous Battle of Flodden. Scotland being what it was, a kingdom perpetually caught between English hostility and French flattery, his upbringing was marked by instability, opportunistic regents, and a surplus of enemies. By the time he began to rule in his own right in the 1530s, James had already developed a distinctive ruling style: paranoid, secretive, spendthrift, and allergic to soap. He was a man of contradictions. On paper, James loved art, music, and French refinement. He spent a fortune constructing palaces and importing tapestries. He maintained correspondence with European courts, had court musicians, and styled himself a Renaissance prince. But you would not have guessed any of that from standing near him. Multiple ambassadors, especially those from France, a country that, even in the 16th century, had a strong perfume game, expressed barely disguised horror at the state of personal hygiene in James's court. The French had been expecting something modest but tolerable. What they found instead was a royal household that smelled like a battlefield between wet wool and week-old venison. And the king, at the center of it all, sweating in brocade and refusing to bathe, seemed either unaware or entirely unbothered. Reports from the period describe James as wearing the same garments for days on end. He was known to sweat heavily, particularly when riding, which he did often, and would frequently return to court without changing. His favored cloaks and jerkins, richly embroidered but rarely cleaned, absorbed the odors of hard travel, nervous perspiration, and the occasional spilled ale. His boots, worn until the leather was cracked and pungent, reportedly gave off a scent most regrettable in close company, according to a particularly unimpressed Spanish envoy. This was not a man unfamiliar with luxury. James had access to bath chambers, fine linens, and a full staff of attendants, but he made little use of them. He often refused to wash more than his hands and face, and even that was inconsistent. One court servant wrote, in a letter to a cousin in Edinburgh, that the king has a habit of wiping his brow with his sleeve and considers that sufficient. His hair, though thick and naturally curly, was rarely cleaned or combed, resulting in what one observer described as a crown of knots. Some tried to excuse this as a cultural difference. Scots, after all, were hardy, practical, used to rough terrain and colder climates. But even within his own kingdom, James's lack of grooming raised eyebrows. Nobles complained privately of long council meetings where the king's scent was present before his words. His mistresses, of which there were many, apparently found the experience of his company more tolerable at a distance. His wife, Madeleine of Valois, was too ill to weigh in for long. She died of tuberculosis just months after arriving in Scotland. His second wife, Mary of Guise, was more diplomatic, but it's hard not to wonder what she thought every time the king entered their chambers in the same damp clothes he'd worn to a hunting expedition 3 days earlier. To be fair, James was not intentionally offensive. He simply seemed to view hygiene as irrelevant to power. He governed through charisma, intimidation, and occasional bursts of generosity. If someone mentioned his smell, he laughed it off. If a servant suggested clean linens, he waved them away. For him, ruling meant appearing strong, not scented. And yet, there is an undeniable irony in a man so obsessed with appearances, so invested in pageantry, and yet so careless with his own person. By the end of his life, James was a man in decline. Years of stress, illness, and paranoia wore him down. He grew gaunt and unpredictable, retreating often to Falkland Palace to sulk in semi-solitude. When his only legitimate son, the future James VI, was born in 1542, James barely celebrated. Just days later, he died at the age of 30, defeated in spirit after yet another disastrous encounter with the English at the Battle of Solway Moss. His body, when prepared for burial, reportedly required extra fumigation, an ominous detail noted in passing by one monastic scribe, who remarked that the king lay not in state, but in scent. He was buried quickly and without fanfare. But if James's stench was born from indifference, the next figure in our list took grime to the battlefield. King Robert the Bruce, the hero of Bannockburn and legend of Scottish resistance, fought for freedom in armor soaked not just in blood and mud, but in days, sometimes weeks, of unwashed royal sweat. The man who beat the English also beat back the rising standards of royal hygiene and left a lasting impression on anyone standing downwind. 19. King Robert the Bruce. To many Scots, Robert the Bruce is not just a king, he's a legend. The warrior king who outwitted the English at Bannockburn. The freedom fighter who battled for Scotland's independence. The noble heart, literally, whose memory was embalmed in myth, statue, and the lyrics of patriotic anthems. But for all his heroic imagery and enduring fame, there's one detail history tends to leave out of the bronze-plated narratives. King Robert the Bruce was profoundly unhygienic, and not just by modern standards. Even for a medieval king who lived during one of the grimiest centuries in European history, the early 1300s, Robert stood out for the sheer intensity of his odor. Of course, one could argue he had good reason. After all, he spent a large portion of his reign on the run, in battle, or living in semi-exile in bogs and caves. But even when circumstances improved, his commitment to filth did not waver. Born in 1274 to a family of noble claimants, Robert began his rise to kingship in a period of national crisis. The death of Alexander III without a clear heir had left Scotland politically unmoored. Edward I of England, smelling weakness, moved in to claim overlordship. What followed was decades of war, betrayal, and very little time for anyone to launder a tunic. When Robert declared himself King of Scots in 1306, he wasn't just stepping into a constitutional mess. He was launching himself into a guerrilla campaign that left little time for courtly rituals, let alone bathing. In his early years as king, Robert led a ragtag rebellion from the fringes of Scottish civilization, rocky islands, remote highlands, and stone-strewn forests. He and his followers lived rough. They slept outdoors, scavenged for supplies, and often went weeks without a proper roof over their heads, or a wash basin. By necessity, Robert dressed like a soldier, heavy wool, leather, chainmail. And while these materials may have protected him in battle, they did nothing for breathability. It's one thing to sweat through armor for a day. It's quite another to do so for a fortnight and then climb into the same quilted gambeson again the next morning. Chroniclers wrote of the sourness of the king's skin, and one legend, likely apocryphal but telling, suggests that Robert once frightened away a would-be assassin in the night, not by drawing a sword, but by simply turning around. French envoys, ever sensitive to such matters, were particularly scandalized when they finally encountered the victorious Bruce after the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Expecting a triumphant but refined monarch, they were instead greeted by a man with matted hair, cracked lips, and a beard that may or may not have been harboring small wildlife. One ambassador politely noted that the king is of strong constitution and favors rustic habits. Translation: he smells like he lives in a tent and hasn't changed his socks since Easter. Even after the war, when Robert's position stabilized and Scotland began to enjoy a brief moment of internal peace, the king's hygiene habits remained stubbornly unchanged. Royal attendants noted that he disliked formal grooming routines. He bathed irregularly, still preferred practical, battle-ready clothing, and viewed personal comfort as something close to sin. His armor was reportedly rarely cleaned, a point of pride even. And he continued to sleep in quarters that were more functional than fragrant. Robert was not unaware of his public image, of course. He understood the power of myth, but that myth did not include perfumes, clean linen, or elegant banquets. His was a kingship of mud, steel, and sweat. He ruled through endurance, and perhaps saw the trappings of cleanliness as aristocratic vanity, something better suited to the courts of France or England, not to a warrior king of the glens. His close companions and household staff simply adapted. Tapestries were hung not just for decoration, but to try to absorb the scent of old wool and unwashed leather. Torches were laced with burning herbs. Tents were aired compulsively. But the Bruce was a man of habit, and if he didn't mind the smell, no one dared to mention it. After all, this was a king who had survived betrayal, excommunication, exiles, and multiple attempts on his life. What's a little body odor compared to all that? When Robert died in 1329, his body was embalmed with particular care, a task that, if some whispered anecdotes are to be believed, required more effort than usual. His heart was famously removed and sent on crusade, carried in a silver casket by Sir James Douglas, who tragically died in battle before it could reach the Holy Land. The casket was returned to Scotland, where Robert's heart was interred at Melrose Abbey. His body, however, remained at Dunfermline Abbey, sealed in lead, preserved in legend, and, presumably, washed at least once before burial, a generous final gift to his attendants. But if Robert the Bruce wore his grime as a badge of military honor, his English counterpart would view dirt not as glory, but as divine protection. King Charles I, sovereign, saint, and sufferer of powdered wigs, believed cleanliness might invite weakness. And in his case, the odor of martyrdom started long before the scaffold. 20. King Charles I. If King Charles I had been born into another family, he might have made a decent country bishop, reserved, soft-spoken, mildly pretentious, and deeply attached to ceremony. Unfortunately for England, he was born into the House of Stuart and handed a throne instead. And while his political decisions would ultimately cost him his head, his personal habits, especially in the realm of hygiene, left a lingering impression long before the executioner arrived. Charles I is often remembered as the monarch who brought Britain to civil war through divine stubbornness. He was a firm believer in the divine right of kings, which conveniently made him wrong about nearly everything else. His leadership was marked by his refusal to compromise, his obsession with absolutism, and his uncanny ability to mistake silence for loyalty. But beneath all that velvet lace and powdered poise was a man who regarded cleanliness with thin-lipped suspicion, and water as a theological risk. Born in 1600, Charles was the second son of James VI and I, The same James who avoided bathing with near-apocalyptic paranoia. From an early age, Charles was physically delicate, plagued with a stammer and overshadowed by his older brother Henry, who conveniently died and left Charles next in line for the throne. But with the crown came responsibilities Charles didn't quite enjoy, including the uncomfortable social expectation that kings should appear, and ideally smell, like kings. He resisted this quietly. To be clear, Charles was not a pigsty monarch. He wore fine clothing, laced his doublets, donned immaculate collars. But his interest in personal hygiene stopped at presentation. According to court accounts, he bathed rarely and reluctantly, believing frequent washing could open the body to ill humors, the 17th century version of bad vibes. This belief was not unusual for the time, but Charles took it a step further. Even among a court known for musk and mildew, he managed to stand out. Rather than risk the treachery of soap and hot water, Charles preferred aromatic gloves, linen shirts, changed somewhat regularly, and scented oils to maintain an appearance of care. But that appearance was, as many discovered, a thin veil. His skin was described as pale and often irritated, not from sensitivity, but from the buildup of powders and unwashed residue. His hair, fashionably long, was often stiff from the combination of pomade and neglect. And his royal garments, though beautiful, were rarely aired properly. Attendants would sometimes hang them overnight in scented smoke to combat the creeping staleness. The results were mixed. Royal aides whispered about the dank odor of the inner chamber. Some remarked that being near Charles for long periods, particularly in summer, required both patience and strong nostrils. His boots were another issue. Known for their tight knee-high design, they trapped sweat and were not regularly cleaned. One page boy reportedly fainted during a fitting session due to the stifling combination of heat and human fermentation. Even his courtiers, many of whom had no particular love of hygiene themselves, noted that the king could be faint of breath and rank of sleeve. A few tried to subtly improve the situation. Physicians suggested bathing in rosewater or vinegar. Herbalists proposed scented sachets for his bedding. Barbers offered scented tonics. Most were politely ignored. Charles saw his habits, or lack thereof, as morally neutral, perhaps even holy. To be too concerned with the body was, after all, a form of vanity. And vanity to Charles was the domain of courtiers and parliamentarians, people who wore perfume to distract from their lack of principle. His queen, Henrietta Maria of France, likely disagreed. A Catholic and a devotee of French court style, she was appalled by many aspects of her husband's kingdom, including its drafty palaces, bland food, and suspicious relationship with hygiene. French court records describe her attempts to introduce scented bathing, fine soaps, and cosmetic discipline to the English court, efforts that Charles tolerated, but did not emulate. The couple loved each other, but not enough to share a tub. As civil war drew closer, Charles's circle tightened, and his habits worsened. He spent long hours in prayer, poring over religious texts, fasting, and neglecting grooming. His chambers became increasingly private and increasingly aromatic. Servants reported that his linens were changed less frequently, and his garments often went unwashed for days. In the final months before his capture, those who visited him in person described a man who seemed ethereal, both in manner and in scent. A saint in shadow, one observer wrote, and shadow brought with it the musk of death. When Charles was executed in 1649, he dressed with deliberate care, a clean shirt, to prevent shivering from being mistaken for fear, gloves, and a heavily perfumed handkerchief. Some say he smelled better on the day of his death than he had in years. His martyrdom would inspire royalists for generations, but his hygiene habits remained in the silent footnotes of courtiers' letters and whispered accounts of royal servants. He believed he was too holy for dirt. In reality, he was simply a man, mortal, musty, and not immune to the slow seep of unwashed linen. And if Charles's odor was born of sanctified resistance, His predecessor in the royal timeline, King Edward I, took a far more martial approach. A man of war, conquest, and towering temper, Edward often returned from campaign not just victorious, but pungent. He carried the smell of battlefield glory and saddle sweat straight into the throne room. And he expected everyone else to get used to it. 21. King Edward I. Nicknamed Longshanks for his towering height and formidable presence, King Edward I of England was many things: conqueror, legislator, crusader, and chronic overshouter. But if history had a sense of smell, he'd also be remembered as one of the most pervasively pungent rulers of the medieval English crown. His campaigns may have been long, brutal, and frequently victorious, but they were also sweaty, unhygienic, and unapologetically ripe. Born in 1239 to King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, Edward was raised for battle, not baths. From an early age, he displayed a talent for warfare, an aversion to comfort, and a remarkable ability to carry the odor of campaign life into every setting, including the royal court. By the time he ascended to the throne in 1272, Edward was already a veteran of multiple military conflicts and had developed a lifestyle more suited to a war horse than a monarch. He was not, in any real sense, a courtly king. Unlike later monarchs who dabbled in poetry, silk waistcoats, and scented powders, Edward operated more like a mobile fortress with opinions. He loathed idleness, preferred outdoor life to indoor diplomacy, and spent most of his reign in motion, leading armies, reinforcing castles, and introducing legislation while covered in the dried sweat of last week's armor. And armor, it turns out, is not great for breathability. Contemporary chroniclers remarked on his sheer physicality. He stood well over 6 feet tall, a towering figure in an age when most men averaged around 5.5. His limbs were long, his shoulders broad, his hands enormous. His presence filled a room, as did the heat radiating from beneath layers of iron, leather, and wool. Servants who attended to his person reported that his armor frequently had to be aired out between uses, and his underpadding, the quilted gambeson worn beneath chainmail, was often soaked through and stiff by the time it was removed. Washing? Infrequent. Changing clothes? Only when necessary. Edward believed in durability, not freshness. On campaign, he wore the same outfit for days, sometimes weeks, with only minor adjustments. A clean tunic thrown over a soiled one, or a pair of boots swapped out only when they began to fall apart. His war tents were described as impressive in size and outfitting, but no amount of brocade could disguise the fact that they smelled more like a barracks than a royal residence. And when the campaign ended, Edward didn't exactly sprint toward a bathhouse. This rough living attitude extended to his peacetime habits as well. Even when at court, Edward's hygiene remained minimal. He preferred functional clothing to fashionable attire and was often seen with dirt under his nails and dried mud on his boots. His personal chambers were plain and practical, his bedding warm but seldom aired. Attendants were known to quietly replace sheets rather than risk asking the king's permission lest he accuse them of softness or extravagance. But perhaps the most damning detail comes from his travel records. Edward was constantly on the move, from London to York, from Winchester to Berwick, dragging his entire household behind him like a slow, smelly tide. This meant that royal accommodations were often makeshift and subjected to limited sanitation. Inns and castles had to prepare for his arrival, not just with space and security, but with scented herbs and smoke to disguise the inevitable musk of a monarch who had spent 3 days in the saddle without changing his socks. And speaking of horses, Edward adored them. He rode frequently, aggressively, and for long distances. As any medieval rider knew, a long day on horseback came with its own unique bouquet: sweat, leather, manure, and friction. Edward embraced all of it. He saw physical discomfort as a necessary part of leadership. If a man couldn't tolerate his own stench, how could he govern others? His marriage to Eleanor of Castile offered little reprieve for those hoping she might encourage a softer, more hygienic side. Eleanor, by all accounts, loved Edward deeply. But she, too, was raised in royal courts where cleanliness was occasional and perfume was political. The two reportedly traveled together extensively and campaigned side by side, sleeping in field tents and sharing the same limited water supplies. Affection, yes. Soap? Not so much. When Edward died in 1307, his body was interred at Westminster Abbey, where his tomb bears the inscription, Edwardus primus Scotorum Malleus, Pactum Serva, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, keep the faith. A fitting tribute to his iron will. But the monks who prepared his body likely remembered a slightly different version. Edwardus primus, Hammer of Soap, avoid at all costs. And so ended the reign of England's great war king, a monarch who feared weakness more than illness, and considered bathing somewhere between unnecessary and unmanly. But if Edward's grime was forged in battle and iron, the next ruler in our lineup would achieve his legendary status not on the battlefield, but through speeches, conquest, and a reputation for wearing the same filthy clothes through one of the most celebrated campaigns in English history. King Henry V may have been the hero of Agincourt, but his laundry habits were less impressive. And when the French finally got close enough to smell their conqueror, their enthusiasm for surrender reportedly faltered. 22. King Henry V. King Henry V is one of England's most mythologized monarchs, a man immortalized by Shakespeare, adored by military historians, and forever associated with the thunderous cry of, "Once more unto the breach." But if anyone had followed him into that breach a little too closely, they might have noticed something a bit less poetic. King Henry smelled like victory, yes, but also like a man who hadn't changed his clothes in days and considered bathing a French affectation. Born in 1386, or 1387 depending on the calendar you prefer, Henry of Monmouth was never supposed to be elegant. He was born into a volatile political climate, raised on horseback, and hardened in battle. By the time he seized the crown in 1413 from his increasingly erratic father, Henry IV, he had already been wounded in combat, governed in council, and built a reputation as a no-nonsense military tactician. Cleanliness, as far as he was concerned, belonged at the bottom of the priority list, somewhere between rest and tenderness. Henry's reign was defined by discipline. He was austere, serious, devout, and ruthlessly focused. Unlike his predecessors, he avoided excess, prided himself on efficiency, and ruled like a commander in a never-ending campaign. This was admirable from a leadership standpoint, but disastrous from a hygienic one. For all his battlefield brilliance, Henry displayed a complete indifference to basic personal maintenance. Contemporary chroniclers and foreign observers repeatedly remarked on Henry's habits, or rather, his refusal to develop any. He was known to wear the same clothing for days at a time, especially during military campaigns. And by clothing, we don't mean elegant tunics and pristine doublets. We're talking about the same armor liner, padded gambeson, and travel cloak, worn through rain, mud, blood, and sweat. And worn again, and again, until it could practically walk to the next battlefield on its own. There are surviving letters from French nobility and clergy during the 100 Years' War that mention, with unmistakable disdain, the coarse manners and pungent presence of the English king. One bishop even noted that Henry entered a cathedral to discuss surrender terms with a scent as strong as his demands. Others described his tent as Spartan, sour, and soaked, suggesting that not even incense could redeem the atmosphere. This wasn't a matter of poverty or oversight. Henry had access to everything a medieval king could desire: physicians, perfumers, laundrymen, herbalists, and luxury textiles. He simply did not care. His worldview was intensely pragmatic. influenced by his strict Lollard-influenced spirituality, which rejected luxury and worldly vanity. To bathe too often, Henry seemed to believe, was a form of weakness. It distracted from the mission. It softened the edge. Even off the battlefield, Henry's hygiene habits remained questionable. Royal attendants recorded that the king frequently declined to change his linens unless persuaded. Bedclothes were worn well past their freshness. Robes, especially his favorites, bore visible signs of prolonged use. He was known to travel light and often refused the full entourage of servants that typically managed a king's wardrobe and personal care. One unlucky squire reportedly described the king's traveling chest as containing little more than maps, books, and a pair of stiffened hose. His facial appearance wasn't much better. Henry shaved inconsistently and washed infrequently. He often appeared in public with unwashed hair, pressed flat under his helmet for days, and skin marked by exposure, weather, and the occasional battlefield wound that never received proper cleaning. His hands, as one French chronicler noted with horror, were often marked with the residue of camp life, a delicate phrase that likely meant oil, dirt, and traces of his last meal. And yet, the people loved him. Why? Because he won. Because he embodied a rugged, unshakable Englishness that felt both real and rare. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry led a ragtag army of exhausted, hungry, and severely outnumbered troops into one of the most astonishing victories in English military history. Mud clung to their boots, arrows rained overhead, and the French cavalry charged headlong into chaos, only to be decisively routed. In that mire of noise and blood, Henry stood like a prophet of war. Unshaven, unwashed, and, by all accounts, completely indifferent to the stench of triumph. His court back in England tried to keep up with his image. Clean robes were prepared, feasts arranged. But Henry remained a soldier at heart. Even in victory, he slept in his armor, often on rough bedding. One attendant recorded that, following Agincourt, the king wore the same damp hose for 3 days, and resisted all efforts to replace them. When he died in 1422, just shy of his 36th birthday, he left behind a united England and a briefly conquered France. He also left behind a collection of armor that, according to the royal quartermaster, was in urgent need of fumigation. His death was mourned as the loss of England's most gallant king, and no one mentioned the smell. But if Henry's grime came gilded in glory, the next monarch chose luxury over laundry. King Richard II loved jewels, mirrors, and extravagant robes, but even he, in all his finery, couldn't quite escape the creeping scent of unwashed ambition. 23. King Richard II. King Richard II wanted to be remembered as a monarch of refinement, a poet king, a divine figure appointed not just to rule, but to elevate. His reign was a carefully orchestrated performance of power, golden robes, jeweled crowns, lavish banquets, and Gothic architecture. In many ways, he was the first English king to lean fully into the aesthetics of absolutism. But beneath the polished surface of his mirror-lined chambers, there was a less glamorous truth. Richard didn't wash. Not regularly, not thoroughly, and not with much concern for what those around him might have thought. Born in 1367, Richard ascended to the throne at the age of 10, following the death of his grandfather, Edward III. England was still reeling from the Black Death, which had wiped out a third of the population and left deep psychological scars across the realm. In this climate of trauma and instability, Richard's rise to power was met with both hope and nervous anticipation. He was young, beautiful, and unusually literate for a monarch of his age. He read romances, wrote poetry, and believed, or at least claimed, that kingship was not just a job, but a sacred identity. This belief in his own divinity would shape every aspect of his reign, from the art he commissioned to the laws he passed, to how he chose to smell. Unlike his more martial predecessors, Richard had little interest in the muddy realities of war. He preferred palaces to battlefields, velvet to armor, sonnets to swords. He surrounded himself with artists, theologians, and fashion-forward courtiers who helped him build a royal image steeped in symbolism and performance. His court was notorious for its extravagance. Towering hairstyles, jeweled belts, imported perfumes, endless fabrics in brilliant colors. He wore cloth of gold so often it became a political statement. Mirrors were placed in royal chambers, not merely as decoration, but as instruments of self-reinforcement. He needed to see himself reflected, constantly. But there was one mirror he seemed unwilling to face, the one that might have told him it was time to take a proper bath. Historical accounts from his reign are tactful, but consistent. Richard rarely bathed. Despite the availability of perfumed waters and dedicated bath chambers within his various residences, he avoided them more often than not. Instead, he relied heavily on scented oils, crushed herbs, and expensive fabrics to project a sense of cleanliness. His undergarments, made of fine linen, were changed irregularly. His outer garments, though luxurious, were often layered to an absurd degree, trapping heat and sweat beneath brocade and fur. During court events, guests reported that his proximity was visually radiant but atmospherically oppressive. In private, things were worse. Attendants tasked with caring for his clothing and personal chambers documented the challenges of dealing with his wardrobe. Tunics and cloaks returned from the king's rooms often bore signs of heavy wear. Stiffened collars, discolored hems, and, more troublingly, lingering smells of perspiration mingled with overused perfume. Some items were so saturated with scent that they were deemed no longer fit for wear and heat. And it wasn't just clothing. Richard was known to sleep in beds draped with heavy curtains and thick upholstery. These were rarely aired. When royal laundresses were granted access to the bedding, they noted moisture without freshness and complained of the challenge in restoring fabrics that had absorbed months of royal residue. This was made worse by the king's preference for sleeping in partial dress, a habit that left bed linen stained and aromatic long after he'd moved on to the next chamber. Visitors from foreign courts, particularly from cleaner corners of Italy and France, were surprised to find such sensory contradictions. One Florentine envoy described the English king as a statue carved in gold, but not washed since creation. Another, more diplomatic, praised the grandeur of the courtly aesthetic, but admitted that the air was not always as graceful as the gesture. To be fair, Richard's habits weren't entirely unique. Medieval hygiene was erratic across Europe. But Richard's particular brand of filth was infuriating because it pretended to be the opposite. He cloaked himself in divine light, quoted Augustine, and demanded that people kneel, even as they discreetly stepped backward mid-bow to avoid catching a full breath of his sanctified musk. And perhaps therein lies the real tension of his reign. Richard wanted to transcend humanity. He wanted to be above politics, above the body, above history itself. But his body, stubborn, sweaty, and inescapably human, kept betraying him. No amount of perfume could change the fact that his divine right came with mortal glands. His downfall, when it came, was as dramatic as his reign. Deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke in 1399, Richard was imprisoned and later died under mysterious circumstances. His once golden image cracked, dulled by political reality. He was buried quietly, without the theatrical fanfare he would have demanded, and when his tomb was opened centuries later, his skeletal remains were found intact, but no scent lingered. The perfumes had finally worn off. If Richard's unwashed glory was dressed in silk and denial, the next royal on our journey embraced a different strategy: cigarettes, champagne, and an unapologetic reliance on perfume over hygiene. Princess Margaret, sister of a queen, rebelled in style, but according to palace staff, smelled far less regal behind closed doors. 24. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, Countess of Snowdon, unofficial royal firecracker, was, in many ways, born into the wrong century. Had she lived in the 18th, she would have been a fixture at the French court, powdered, provocative, and theatrical. Had she come of age in the 21st, she might have been a social media icon, posing in vintage gowns with a cigarette in one hand and a bitter quip in the other. But in the mid-20th century, stuck between post-war austerity and rigid royal duty, she became something else entirely, a tabloid fascination, a scandal magnet, and, if her former staff are to be believed, a woman who often smelled more like ashtray than aristocracy. Born in 1930 into a monarchy still licking its wounds from abdication, Margaret was never meant to reign, but she was raised to dazzle. And she did, at least in public. With her striking looks, haughty charm, and contralto voice, she became the glamorous foil to her dutiful older sister. Where Elizabeth embodied restraint, Margaret radiated rebellion. She wore Dior while the Queen wore wool. She smoked during dinner. She drank before breakfast. And when she walked into a room, heads turned, not always in admiration. Because behind the diamonds, beneath the mink, and somewhere in the cloud of Chanel No. 5, there was often a whiff of something less refined. Those closest to her, valets, maids, dressers, drivers, spoke candidly, if quietly, about Margaret's hygiene habits. She was, by all accounts, not a fan of bathing, not in the daily, ritualistic soap and sponge way expected of modern royalty. Instead, she preferred to cover rather than cleanse. Her reliance on perfume was legendary. Her loyalty to cigarettes, unshakable. Combined, these two habits created an aura that was more chemical cocktail than personal fragrance. Staff at Kensington Palace, where she lived for decades, reported that her bathroom was a sanctuary of mirrors and bottles, not washcloths and water. Shelves of scent lined the walls. French sprays, English oils, imported atomizers. But the bathtub, rarely used. She would run it occasionally, sit in it sometimes. But soap was more symbolic than practical. One longtime attendant noted, perhaps too politely, that Her Royal Highness preferred dry cleansing. Mornings were theatrical affairs. She'd rise late, often around 11 a.m., and begin her infamous 3-hour getting-ready routine. This included a light breakfast in bed, coffee, toast, juice, an hour spent reading the newspapers and chain-smoking, and a long stretch in front of the mirror applying makeup, styling her hair, and selecting the day's outfit. At no point, according to multiple staff accounts, was there much evidence of a traditional wash. She would freshen up, powder down, spray lavishly, and emerge ready for public life, cloaked in elegance and eau de masking agent. Her undergarments, staff noted with some dismay, were changed less frequently than protocol advised. Her dresses, though exquisite, were often reworn without proper laundering, and her sheets, royal monogrammed linens no less, were known to retain the scent of cigarettes, sweat, and perfume long after she had vacated them. One cleaner described her bedroom as a study in velvet, smoke, and second-day glamour. And then there were the cigarettes. Margaret smoked, not socially, not occasionally, but constantly. From the 1950s through the 1980s, she rarely appeared without a cigarette between her fingers. Her apartment smelled of it. Her clothes absorbed it. Her hair, lacquered and untouched by shampoo for days at a time, retained the scent of stale smoke with impressive tenacity. At parties, she would leave a trail of ash and scent behind her. At home, the walls reportedly yellowed faster than expected. But what made it all so paradoxical, so royally ironic, was how obsessed Margaret was with image. She cared deeply about how she appeared in photographs. She demanded flattery, control, and lighting. She insisted on being addressed properly, presented properly, and admired from the correct angle. But when it came to hygiene, she seemed to consider the matter beneath her, something the common folk worried about. She, after all, had perfume. This was not laziness exactly. It was a kind of cultivated defiance. Margaret was raised to believe she was special, not just royal, but rare. She didn't bathe like everyone else because she wasn't everyone else. And if the palace smelled a bit after a party, well, that was the price of charm. Still, the contrast was jarring. At public engagements, she shimmered in diamonds and sarcasm. But in private, her glamour had a half-life. Those who worked closely with her reported that prolonged proximity revealed the difference between surface and substance. She was magnificent from across the room, one former maid confessed. But up close, the cracks were aromatic. By the 1990s, as her health declined and royal relevance slipped through her fingers, Margaret retreated into semi-isolation. Her body, weakened by years of alcohol and tobacco, began to falter. But the perfume bottles stayed full. The cigarettes stayed lit. And the baths, reportedly, stayed empty. She died in 2002 at the age of 71, in a world that had largely moved on from powdered royalty. Her funeral was respectful, her legacy complicated. She left no memoirs, no apologies, just a lingering question. What happens when a woman raised to sparkle decides that soap isn't required? If Margaret's grime came wrapped in pearls and sarcasm, her grandfather's was more traditional, and no less pungent. King George V, stiff-backed and duty-bound, hated emotion, modernity, and regular bathing. As Edwardian standards rose around him, George stood firm, unwashed, unworried, and wearing the same stained undergarments until even his staffs began to pray for laundry day. 25. King George V. King George V may have been the last British monarch to look comfortable on a postage stamp, stern, immaculately mustached, and deeply committed to the illusion of national stability. To the public, he was the face of Edwardian restraint and wartime patriotism. A grandfather of modern monarchy. A man of few words, even fewer expressions, and exactly one expression of personal style, mildly irritated. But behind that firm-jawed, monocled exterior was a man whose personal habits clung, literally, to the past. George V loathed excess. He feared change, and he absolutely despised the idea of regular bathing. Born in 1865, George was never intended to be king. That role was supposed to fall to his older brother, Prince Albert Victor. But fate, and perhaps poor health hygiene of its own, had other plans. Albert died young, and George was thrust into the direct line of succession. He took to the role with a kind of grim naval efficiency. Having served in the Royal Navy in his youth, George retained much of its rigid structure in his adult life. Early rising, strict routines, and a hatred for anything that smelled like indulgence. Ironically, this hatred extended even to things that might have improved his actual scent. From the accounts of palace staff, George V had a distinctly utilitarian approach to personal hygiene. He bathed infrequently, perhaps once or twice a week, and never with any flourish. His preferred method was the sponge bath, performed rapidly and without enjoyment. Full immersion in water, he reportedly believed, was a foreign affectation. He once described prolonged bathing as a waste of hot water and good time. Even for his era, a time when hygiene practices were inconsistent but improving, this was considered old-fashioned. By the early 20th century, soap and water had become commonplace, even expected among the upper classes. Yet George clung stubbornly to Victorian minimalism. He did not believe in pampering. He did not believe in comfort. And he certainly didn't believe in swapping out his undergarments unless the situation was urgent. One footman, writing in a private letter, described the king's underwear as regrettably durable. Another recalled the unpleasant duty of removing the monarch's shirts after several days of wear, garments stiff with perspiration and pipe smoke. These weren't exaggerations. George was known for wearing the same vest and drawers for days at a time, despite the visible wear and, according to multiple sources, a growing smell that perfume could not mask. He disliked fresh laundry, reportedly complaining that washed clothes felt too new. In fact, his general preference for frugality often bordered on the obsessive. He once ordered the royal shoemaker to patch up a worn pair of boots for the 5th time rather than make a new set. He reprimanded staff for replacing linens that weren't yet ragged. And he reused handkerchiefs, not once, not twice, but several times, folding them carefully to avoid revealing the evidence. Frugality for George was next to godliness. Cleanliness? Less so. His grooming routine was similarly sparse. He maintained his iconic beard with military precision, but reportedly washed his hair only as often as he could tolerate it, which wasn't often. He despised barbershop scents and opted for plain, unscented tonics when available. He preferred to keep his fingernails short, but not always clean. And while he owned cologne, he rarely used it. He believed a man should smell like a man, and if that meant the faint aroma of tobacco, leather, and unwashed cotton, so be it. Still, there was a strange kind of discipline in it all. George's rejection of modern hygiene wasn't rooted in sloppiness. It was rooted in principle. He viewed luxury as weakness and grooming as vanity. He kept to a rigid schedule. He upheld an image. He was a king who woke up at the same hour every day, wrote letters in the same chair, ate at the same table, and wore the same threadbare underclothes until they gave out, or someone gathered the courage to throw them away. Even his bedrooms were exercises in monarchical minimalism. Despite having access to the finest amenities in Europe, George insisted on simple furnishings, scratchy wool blankets, and drafty windows. His chambermaids were instructed not to overclean the royal quarters, as he disliked the smell of strong soaps, a sprig of lavender maybe, anything more, and he would complain. His wife, Queen Mary, tolerated it, though tolerance is perhaps the politest word available. She was famously stoic, fiercely loyal, and reportedly had her own bedroom down the hall, which may or may not have been a strategic retreat. She once referred to her husband's private habits as predictable, if nothing else. When George V died in 1936, the monarchy was left in the hands of his son, Edward VIII, a man who would go on to abdicate the throne in favor of romance, silk pajamas, and full-length bubble baths. But for all his stiffness, George had held the crown together through war, scandal, and shifting times. He was the last British monarch to truly believe that modesty, stoicism, and mildly soiled garments were the foundation of kingship, and thus ends our 25-part descent into the less fragrant corridors of royalty, where pearls, power, and perfume did battle against centuries of royal refusal to wash behind the ears. Because for all their palaces and portraits, some of Britain's most iconic royals couldn't be bothered with a bar of soap, and the result? A royal legacy that still lingers, faintly, in the historical nose.